is on parade. America and Germany together in the fight for freedom. In his first visit to the home of the brave, the German Chancellor received a warm welcome from the Big Apple. He greeted enthusiastic crowds in Times Square and took in the view from the top of the Empire State Building. Watch that first step. Later, the Fuhrer paid a call to Lady Liberty, where he was given the keys to the city. The whirlwind tour was capped off by a 4-hour speech to city leaders where the Fuhrer outlined his vision for a prosperous alliance between Germany and America.
And people today don't know how close that prosperous alliance actually was to becoming a reality. Today, it's hard to fathom how that could ever happen, but entering the 1930s on the heel of the beginning of the Great Depression, it was a very different world. A world where fascism and intolerance were on the rise, and nowhere was this more exemplified than with the rise of Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, who, entering the 1930s with a massive following already, had plenty to say to the frenzied crowds that were more than eager to gobble up his every word.
Mit den Verantwortlichen an diesen Opfern ein unerbittliches Gericht zu halten. Unser deutsches Vaterland, unser deutsches Volk, unser heiliges Reich der Zukunft.
And of course there was also Italy, being led by Benito Mussolini.
Restituita la sua dignità e ne avete rialzato l'ara in Roma!
And naturally Hitler and Mussolini were friends and allies. Meanwhile, over in England, a fanatic named Oswald Mosley was rallying thousands of people to the banner of fascism.
Gentlemen, this great meeting is gathered here tonight to hear the policy and fate of fascism. We say that England is not dead. We say, and I ask you to say with us, lift up your voices in this great meeting in the heart of England. Send to all the world a message. England lives and marches on.
And across the Atlantic Ocean in the United States, we see.
In New York City, loudest mouthpiece in this Nazi propaganda drive is the national chairman of the Hitler-inspired German-American Bund. He is Fritz Kuhn, former German machine gunner, now a naturalized American citizen, who claims to have enrolled 200,000 U.S. Germans under the swastika. At his meetings, Führer Kuhn preaches orthodox fascist doctrine.
Diesen Lügen und Verleumdungen, die die Presse tagtäglich in den Tageszeitungen bringt, Widerstand leisten kann.
Across the United States, Führer Kuhn has established 25 summer camps and drill grounds.
And let's have a look at a few of those 25 summer camps spread across the country. And have a look at the name of this street. So that was footage of some of the special events and rallies at these summer camps. But they were camps for kids and youth, like a Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts kind of thing, done in Nazi style. They would do daily roll call and exercise in the mornings. Practice proper hygiene and cleaning. And of course the proper daily flag raising ceremony before breakfast. They would engage in sports, including boxing, and of course just having some good old plain fun. So all this, and full daily servings of instruction, manipulation, and indoctrination into the Nazi faith, so that your child has every opportunity and is equipped with all the tools needed to develop the right values and properly grow up into that young man or woman that you as a parent can proudly call a piece of shit and a blight on society. Here's a 29-page dossier written by the German-American Bund in 1939. And in it we can see the history of the Bund, first established in 1924 with 4 chapters, or locals as they call them. And by 1933, they were the Friends of New Germany with 20 chapters across the country from Brooklyn, New York to San Francisco, California. And remember we saw Camp Siegfried earlier? Well, that was started up by the Friends of New Germany. And by 1936, the German-American Bund was born with 50 chapters now across the country. And remember that map on the news clip showing where 25 of the summer camps were located? Found in the dossier is the 1930 census numbers showing the population rates for German-born people in each state, and notice by 1939 where the bulk of their summer youth camps were. The support for fascism and the Nazis was on the rise across the country. And that picture is from a massive Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden on May 17, 1934, which also happens to be the same day the McCormick-Dickstein Committee began their hearings. And the following day we can see the reviews in the papers. And here's another massive Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden on February 20th, 1939. So as you can see, throughout the decade of the 1930s, there was a lot of support for fascism and the German-American Bund Nazis. And in 1933, there was a plot to seize the White House and install a fascist government. And it wasn't originating from the German-American Bund, but rather from a group of right-wing American businessmen. And it should say some of the plotters who are alleged to involve some of the most famous families in America, owners of Heinz, Birdseye, Good Tea, Maxwell House, and George Bush's grandfather, Prescott, believed that their country should adopt the policies of Hitler and Mussolini to beat the Great Depression. And of course we'll be taking a deep look into this. But imagine if the coup attempt was successful and the White House was now backing the masses of American German Bund fanatics. Now, of course, thankfully, this coup attempt never happened, and that's mostly due to the actions of one man, Major General Smedley Darlington Butler. Most people today recognize the names of Eisenhower and Patton and MacArthur, but have never heard of Smedley Butler. But in the first half of the 1900s, up until the outbreak of World War II, Smedley Butler was easily the most publicly recognized figure from the military, and also the most popular, from both the citizenry and from within the ranks of the military as well. His life's adventures and the media attention that came with it certainly qualified a bit of celebrity status about him, and he was one of the most decorated officers in United States military history, serving in campaigns over 3 decades. So we're going to take a deep dive into the incredible life of Smedley Darlington Butler, and there's a lot to look at, and along the way we'll see some events that still have repercussions all the way up to this very day. Born on July 30th, 1881 in Westchester, Pennsylvania, Smedley Butler was born into a pretty prominent family. His father was longtime Congressman Thomas S. Butler, who served from 1897 until his death in 1928. And his grandfather, who Smedley Butler was named after, previously held the same post in Congress from 1887 to 1891. But a young Smedley Butler had no intentions of following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather into the halls of Congress, or any other politics. Instead, with the United States going to war with Spain, at the young age of only 16 years old, Smedley Butler set his sights on the military, and on his way home from school one day, went to enlist. This article is from 1900, but they're talking about Smedley Butler's enlistment 2 years earlier in 1898. And we see, going to Westchester without his father's knowledge, he enlisted with Company I, 6th Regiment, NGP, but failed to pass the physical examination, his eyes being a little at fault. But a couple days later he saw an advertisement, and learning there was to be a competitive examination for lieutenants in the Marine Service at Washington, he resolved to try it, but his father objected. Finally, he consented to the trial, but would tender no assistance. The boy, Smedley Butler, went to Washington, passed the ordeal of examination, and out of a class of over 200, was second. He was given a second lieutenant commission and assigned to duty on Admiral Sampson's flagship, the New York. Although at that time not yet 17 years old, he saw active service and plenty of it. He was one of the leaders of that gallant band of Marines that landed on Cuban soil at Guantanamo and engaged the Spanish forces in the guerrilla warfare that ensued for several days. And he was on board the New York during the destruction of Cervera's fleet. And within a few weeks, by August of 1898, this is what Guantanamo Bay looked like. And if you were ever wondering after 9/11, this is the beginning origins of how the United States owns a naval base in Cuba. The following year, in 1899, we see that Smedley Butler is the youngest officer in the Army, Marines actually, and is now on his way to the Philippines to fight in the Philippine-American War. And the next year, in 1900, Smedley Butler found himself in China fighting what's known as the Boxer Rebellion. And on July 13th, 1900, 2 weeks before his 19th birthday, he found himself and his men in a life-and-death firefight, where his actions, which included rescuing a wounded soldier and himself being shot in the process of doing so, would see Smedley Butler awarded the Marine Corps' Brevet Medal. And while he was in the hospital recovering, he would receive a promotion in rank to captain. And as they note in the article here, he had just celebrated his 19th birthday, and he was already a veteran of 3 wars, noting he has served with distinction in Cuba, the Philippines, and China. And as we can see in just one example here, newspapers were very impressed with young Smedley Butler's exploits. Next, in 1903, Smedley Butler would be sent to Honduras, and while I haven't been able to track down any newspapers or documents from 1903 showing his involvement there, we see that in 1935 he wrote an article for Common Sense magazine stating he was there, and why. And we'll get into that a little later on, of course, but it would seem that at this early stage in 1903, Smedley Butler was beginning to realize something. Here's a peer-reviewed thesis published in 2013 by the University of California on the life of Smedley Butler, and in a section on Honduras in 1903, they write, "This intervention was largely a warning to other nations establishing exclusive American hegemony, creating an economic foothold that would later benefit companies such as United Fruit. Butler and the Marines were to assist with the surrender of the government troops. He seemed unimpressed with the Honduran rebel army or the civilians the Marines were sent to guard, saying, quote, 'We may find some American interests that need protecting,' end quote." So that's pretty interesting. He was stationed on the USS Marietta, and we see, in 180 landings of the United States Marines, published in 1934, a Marine Guard of 13 Marines from the Marietta was landed on the 23rd of March for the protection of the consulate. This guard remained until the 30th or 31st, when it was withdrawn. And remember what Smedley Butler said? Now let's have a look at what this newspaper from 1903 is saying. President Irving of the United Fruit Company's Breakwater, direct from Puerto Cortez, reports that Americans are fleeing from Spanish Honduras in expectancy of a revolution which has been brewing in that republic for the past 2 months, on account of the refusal of President Sierra, the present incumbent, to surrender the presidential seat to Senor Pinilla, who, the reports say, has been officially elected the successor of Senor Sierra. So, it's a good thing President Irving of United Fruit is there to report on things. And what's really at stake here? Like Smedley Butler said, American interests. Next, some 9 months later in December of 1903, Smedley Butler would lead a company of Marines into Panama. And this is the beginning of how the United States would end up owning the Panama Canal for almost 100 years. Today, what we know as the country of Panama, or the Republic of Panama, didn't exist back in 1900. Back then, Panama was part of Colombia, and there's a long story there, but in essence, Panama had declared independence from Spain in 1821 and joined the Republic of Gran Colombia, and was part of Colombia since, until our story begins. And I have to say I was a little surprised to see this story in The Guardian. And that US president was Teddy Roosevelt. And again, we see one of the Wall Street kings playing a role in J.P. Morgan. Now let's step back to 1901 and have a look. And we see there's reports about the alleged imminent purchase by the United States of the Panama Canal. Now at this point, the Panama Canal had been started by France in 1881 and wasn't even halfway finished when they abandoned the project after the company responsible went bankrupt in 1889. And now the US is dealing with the new Panama Canal Company and the Colombian government. By January of 1902, not everyone is on board with this, as we can see Senator John Morgan saying that he wouldn't give 30 cents for the canal. And in the article they refer to the canal as a ditch. But this opinion is very much in the minority view. Most supported the takeover, on both sides of the political spectrum. By January 3, 1903, we see there were further delays in the matter confirming the Panama Canal Treaty. And that's mainly on the side of the Colombians. By March 4, 1903, we see the Panama Canal Company has accepted the proposal of Attorney General Knox for an extension of the option of the United States to purchase the canal if suitable agreement can be made by treaty with Colombia. 2 weeks later, on March 17, 1903, we see the Panama Canal Treaty has been ratified by the Senate by a vote of 73-5. That's the United States Senate. And the terms they agreed to include paying the Colombian government $10 million in gold, and after 9 years start paying $250,000 a year. And the first lease would be for 100 years, and renewable thereafter at the pleasure of the United States. It would be 6 miles wide across the country from the Atlantic to the Pacific, picking up the canal project where it was left off at. And notice the United States was given police and sanitary jurisdiction. So that basically means the United States owns the canal and land in perpetuity. But technically Colombia still has sovereignty over the land. But something to keep in mind is that the Colombian Congress still has to ratify this, which we can see a couple of months later in June is still a problem. President Roosevelt sent today for William Nelson Cromwell, counsel for the Panama Canal Company, and had a half-hour's conference with him on the canal situation. The conference will resume at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Now fast forward to September 24, 1903, and we see the time for the ratification of the Panama Canal Treaty by the Colombian Congress expired on the 22nd. So still no treaty. Now something to understand here at this point is that there was a Colombian civil war going on for 3 years that just ended at the end of 1902. And it was a liberal versus conservative war, with the conservatives on the winning end. And they were the government in power at the time that the United States were dealing to buy the Panama Canal. And during the war, the people running the Panama Canal Company were on the liberal side, as were the majority of the Panamanian people. So at this point in the Panama Canal Treaty, the United States government wanted it, the Panama Canal Company wanted the deal done, the Colombian administration wanted it done, but the Colombian Congress wouldn't ratify it. So, 9 days later, although we wouldn't see it till the next day on November 4th, 1903, Panama declares its independence. The independence of the Isthmus of Panama was proclaimed at 6 o'clock Tuesday evening. All government militia and naval officers imprisoned. 3,000 men are in arms. American warships have been sent to Panama and Cologne to protect American interests. Of course. 2 days later, on November 6, 1903, the United States recognizes the Republic of Panama, which is the country of Panama as we know it today. 3 days later, on November 9th, 1903, we see warships to stop troops of Colombia. Embarking of Colombian troops from Buenaventura or any other Colombian port for the Isthmus will not be permitted by the Washington government, and American warships will be ordered to any port upon receipt of an intimation that Colombian troops will attempt to sail for the Isthmus. The Washington government holds that this policy is in the interest of the general good. The State Department has been informed that a commission of 3 members with full powers to conclude a canal treaty will leave Panama tomorrow for Washington to begin negotiations immediately. And of course everything would get signed and the United States would take over the canal project and would open up the Panama Canal by 1914. Anyways, 10 days after that, we see on November 19th, 1903, that J.P. Morgan and Company are named the fiscal agents for Panama. And this would be the same role that his son J.P. Morgan Jr. would play in the first 3 years of World War I as the sole purchasing agent in the United States for Britain and France, as we saw in an earlier chapter in this series. So now we can see that he learned that trick from his father, J.P. Morgan Sr. in Panama in 1903. And here they say this selection of the Morgan Company is very pleasing to the members, especially to J. Pierpont himself, whose fortunes have not been all that could be desired lately. But that's not the real scandal here. From the congressional hearings in 1977 called the Panama Canal Treaty Ramifications, we see why then did Teddy Roosevelt swing the big stick and foment a phony revolution in Colombia in order to save $10 million for the coffers of a bankrupt French-owned company? The answer, which came out years later, is that the French company was French no longer. Its shares had been secretly bought up shortly before by a syndicate of Wall Street bankers, headed by J.P. Morgan and Company. The syndicate hired eminent Wall Street lawyer William Nelson Cromwell to get the American money, and it was Cromwell, sitting in the White House itself, who wrote Teddy Roosevelt's dispatches and orders, and engineered the entire operation. After the syndicate got the $40 million, they were able to sell their shares to the U.S. government for twice what they had paid. So just like we saw in the very first chapter of part 1 of this series, there's J.P. Morgan again ripping off the U.S. government. And notice who the lawyer was for this secret syndicate of Wall Street bankers led by J.P. Morgan? William Nelson Cromwell, who, as we just saw, was also counsel for the Panama Canal Company supposedly negotiating with President Roosevelt. So now you're familiar with the corruptive roots at the heart of the creation of what we know today as the Republic of Panama, and we'll see a lot more of Panama in some upcoming chapters. But back to November of 1903, and 5 weeks after J.P. Morgan and Company were named the fiscal agents for Panama, on December 14th, 1903, as we saw in another newspaper at the beginning of this segment, Captain Smedley Butler was in command of a company of Marines that just landed to be deployed in Panama, thus saving American interests and keeping the Panama Canal safe, in the interests of the general good. The year 1905 would certainly be a happy one for Smedley Butler, as he would get engaged to his bride-to-be, Ethel Conway Peters. And on July 1st, 1905, we see the day before, on June 30th, the happy couple were married. Fast forward to 1909, and we see trouble brewing with Nicaragua's longtime president, Jose Zelaya, and the United States recalled their diplomat from Managua. And by July of 1909, there was a failed revolution attempt against Zelaya. One of the leaders among the anti-Zelaya revolutionaries by this point is Juan Jose Estrada, a one-time friend and political colleague of Zelaya, and is now favored by the United States. A few months later, in October of 1909, we see reports of a successful revolution in Nicaragua. Reports say Zelaya is disposed, and Estrada is named provisional president. And down below we see the Americans are jubilant because of the overthrow of Zelaya. But Zelaya is not exactly going away just yet. A month later, in November of 1909, we see the US is sending warships down. And why? to guard American interests in Nicaragua, of course. And we'll come back to some of those in a minute, but we also see this. Washington aroused at alleged execution of 2 Americans captured while serving an insurgent army. A week later, on November 26, 1909, we see troops underway to punish Zelaya. A battalion of 500 Marines boarded the transport Prairie to some Central American point near enough to Nicaragua to punish President Zelaya for the assassination of 2 Americans. And notice how it's now being framed as an assassination of the 2 Americans, not an execution of them for fighting alongside the insurgents, as we just saw. Anyways, in the middle of all this, we also see Major Smedley D. Butler is in command of the Marines en route for the south. And by December 24th, 1909, Zelaya flees to Europe by gunboat, and that would be the end of him. And we also see Estrada gain some popularity, but he wouldn't actually become president until August of 1910. And while he did have the support of the United States, they actually favored his vice president, Adolfo Diaz, who would become 2-time president of Nicaragua starting in 1911. But things were just getting started, and we'll be seeing a lot more of Nicaragua as we go along in this series. And remember how we saw Smedley Butler and the Marines were sent in to guard American interests in Nicaragua? And what were those interests? Smedley Butler would write in 1935, "I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. And then would see Brown Brothers begin to control the banking and economy of Nicaragua in the decades to follow. Over the next few years, Smedley Butler was stationed in Panama and in command of the Marines at Camp Elliott. He would also bring his young and growing family down to Panama to live with him as well. And though the United States was well established in the Canal Zone and continuing the construction of the Panama Canal, there were still some pretty intense incidents along the way. And about a month after that little skirmish in Panama, on August 16, 1912, Smedley Butler would be back in Nicaragua again to protect Americans. The collier Justin, the State Department learned yesterday, arrived at Corinto yesterday with 250 Marines under the command of Major Smedley Butler, who reported at once to the senior officer, Captain Tarun, commanding the gunboat Annapolis, who has been given full authority to deal with the military situation in Nicaragua as it affects American interests. And they weren't there to fight against the government of Nicaragua again, but rather to help it, of course. Remember, they came in to help depose longtime Nicaraguan President Jose Zelaya? And after a couple of quick acting presidents, we saw that one of the rebellion leaders whom the United States favored at the time, Juan Estrada, would become president from August 30th, 1910 until May 9th, 1911. Technically acting president. And then the United States' preferred president, Adolfo Diaz, would take the helm after Estrada. So that's who the Nicaraguan president is during these events, and the Marines are there to help his administration, as well as American interests. And Smedley Butler and his Marines, along with the Nicaraguan military, are now fighting against General Luis Mina. And he was one of those acting presidents before Juan Estrada, for all of 3 days. The 3 days before Estrada became president, August 27, 1910 to August 30th, 1910. So now that Smedley Butler and the Marines have arrived to bolster the forces of the Nicaraguan military against General Mina's rebel army, the outcome is pretty much a foregone conclusion. We see a couple days later on August 18, 1912. The rebel losses are heavy, and there was a battle that lasted 4 days. About the Marines, we see the battalion, composed of 3 companies of American Marines under the command of Major Smedley D. Butler, which arrived here Thursday morning from Panama by way of Corinto to reinforce the smaller detachment of American bluejackets landed previously to protect the lives and property of Americans, was the cause of great relief to the Nicaraguan government and to Americans and other foreign residents as well as to citizens. The situation at the capital Tuesday and Wednesday was horrible, and the arrival of the American reinforcements has restored confidence and turned the despondency of the populace into rejoicing. And I'll bet some of those people rejoicing would include Brown Brothers. A couple weeks later, by the end of August 1912, we see Smedley Butler is headquartered in Nicaragua. And a few weeks later, on September 19, 1912, we see the rebels are being driven back. And leading the charge is Smedley Butler, clearing the railroad route from Managua, Nicaragua to Grenada. 4 days later, on September 23, 1912, General Luis Mina would surrender. And on September 29, 1912, we would see the day before, under the watchful eye of U.S. Marines, General Luis Mina was placed on board the United States cruiser Cleveland to be sent into exile to, of all places, Panama. Now let's fast forward to January 11th, 1914. And after a year of Victoriano Huerta's dictatorship in Mexico, the Marines would be sent in. There were no developments in the political situation in Mexico reported to the State or War Departments yesterday. From the Navy Department, announcement was made of the assignment to command the Marines of the 3rd Division of the Atlantic Fleet, now lying off Veracruz, of Major Smedley D. Butler, honorably mentioned for heroic services in the recent Nicaraguan campaign. Major Butler has been on duty in the Canal Zone, and with 10 other officers was yesterday detached from Camp Elliott, Panama, for duty in Mexican waters. And those Mexican waters were off of Veracruz. And to give you an idea, Veracruz is located roughly here. And interestingly enough, the day before, on January 10th, 1914, Pancho Villa was leading his rebel forces in attacks in northern Mexico. Anyways, jumping to April 22nd, 1914, we see U.S. goes to war. And of course, war was never declared, but we can see that it was nearly a reality. And this is only like a year and a half before the whole Zimmerman telegram episode that we looked at in an earlier chapter of this series. So, as mentioned, war wasn't actually declared, but Smedley Butler and his Marines were already on the move into Veracruz. American Marines seized the Custom House today by order of Admiral Fletcher. The landing force was then attacked by the Hurtaists with rifle and artillery fire. Other information received at the Navy Department was to the effect that the American forces in seizing the yards of the railroad running from Veracruz to Mexico City had taken 1,200 cars and 20 engines. The Mexicans were preparing to move these cars and engines out of the yards towards Mexico City yesterday, and the capture of this equipment was one of the considerations that led to the decision on the part of the United States authorities to seize the port without waiting for formal action by Congress. This equipment will be of the greatest value in the transporting of troops over the railroad towards Mexico City from Veracruz as a base. So how about that, without a formal declaration of war or any authorization of any kind from Congress? Admiral Fletcher sent in the Marines with one of the goals being to capture the railroad system operating between Mexico City and Veracruz in order to use Veracruz as a base while transporting troops around, which obviously has longer-term intentions, which is actually what happened, as the U.S. would occupy Veracruz for the next 7 months. The Navy Department had no definite information last night as to what battalion of Marines from the Prairie had been landed. The department said that it was one battalion from the 2nd Advanced Base Region. These are one of the finest bodies in the service. They have been stationed for a long time at Panama and have been preparing with a special view to service in Mexico. It is presumed that they are under the command of Major Smedley D. Butler, who has distinguished himself in service in the Boxer Rebellion and the fighting in Nicaragua a few years ago. And it was indeed Smedley Butler who led the way in the battle for Veracruz. And in fact, for his actions, he was awarded his first of 2 Medals of Honor. And here's the citation that goes with it. The next day, on April 23, 1914, we see Carranza may join Huerta. And along with Pancho Villa, you may recognize these guys as major players in the Mexican Revolution. And ironically enough, the one with the most favorable opinion of the United States at this point in time is actually Pancho Villa. Huerta's federal troops have been fighting the Marines at Veracruz, and he doesn't like the United States just as much as the United States doesn't like him or his administration. Venustiano Carranza also doesn't like the United States and is very vocal in his opinions about it. Meanwhile, Pancho Villa is the one sometimes making public appearances to tone down and sometimes apologize for some of the rhetoric his general and partner Carranza would be spouting. On April 24, 1914, 2 days after Smedley Butler led the Marines into Veracruz, we see Mexican mobs trample on U.S. flag, and U.S. controls environs of city of Veracruz. American Marines and Blue Jackets controlled today a radius of at least 5 miles around the city of Veracruz, in which normal conditions had been virtually restored. Outposts were pushed further out in a southerly direction early this morning to the water supply station at Trajar, and Marines and sailors were dispatched there on a train to obtain control of all pipelines into the city. They took with them oil fuel to run the pumping plant. To the west and northwest, Captain Smedley Butler commands all the approaches to the city. And that's actually Major Smedley Butler, to be correct. So yet again we see Smedley Butler leading the way into battlegrounds, this time even earning the Medal of Honor for his actions. And let's have a look at some of his other actions that took place before he led U.S. forces into Veracruz. And we have to skip ahead to the next month, on May 28, 1914. Referring to Smedley Butler, we see the headline says, "Fighting Quakers Perilous Mission. Major Butler risks life to map route to Mexico City. Obtained plan of defenses." All that Major Butler, known among the Marines and now to the sailors as Hell Devil, did was travel up to Mexico City, accompanied by a sergeant and a corporal of Marines 2 weeks before the occupation of Veracruz and in anticipation of a march by the army to the capital, and draw maps of the best route, not forgetting the most advantageous avenues of approach to the city itself, together with its defenses and the location of the defending forces. That may not sound so very thrilling, but it was. The whole country was aroused against Americans, and the 3 men took their lives in their hands. A dozen times they were near to capture and death. Once, at the very end of the journey, which lasted a week and a half, Butler was arrested by federal soldiers in Veracruz. Fortunately for him, he had had foresight enough to stop at the Council Canada's office and leave there all his maps and notes, so that when he was searched just as he was about to step into a boat to return to the Utah, he didn't have a single incriminating thing upon him unless a copy of the Mexican Herald was one, so they had to let him go. So imagine that, infiltrating by foot into Mexico City and back, and mapping out the best routes and defenses along the way, like a spy. And actually, when I first saw his wedding picture, I thought he looked a little bit Daniel Craigish a bit, like he could have been 007's father or something like that. A year later, in August of 1915, Smedley Butler would find himself stationed in Haiti for the next 3 years. Looking into Volume 1 of the Congressional Hearings into the Occupation and Administration of Haiti and Santo Domingo, published in 1922, we can see the exact dates of Smedley Butler's time in Haiti from Smedley Butler's own testimony. And we can see that he landed in Haiti on the 10th of August 1915 and remained there continuously until the 9th of March 1918. And he was also the first commander and organizer of the Gendarmerie of Haiti. And gendarmerie basically means a military force charged with policing duties among the civilian population. And Smedley Butler began that role unofficially on December 3rd, 1915. and then officially through a proclamation by Colonel Walker Littleton on February 1st, 1916. And when asked about what the proclamation meant to him or how it affected him, Smedley Butler replied, "That made me Chief of Police in Haiti. I assumed all responsibility for the safety and proper policing of the Republic of Haiti." And for the next 2+ years, Smedley Butler would be the chief of the Gendarmerie of Haiti, administering all the policing of Haiti's population. And this role would set the stage for some future positions Smedley Butler would find himself in, as we'll see as we go. But first, let's go back a year before Smedley Butler's time here and have a look at another incursion by the Marines into Haiti. And this is from Volume 2 of the Congressional Inquiry into the Occupation and Administration of Haiti and Santo Domingo. And from the testimony of Ernest Angel, future American Civil Liberties Union leader. We had done the extraordinary thing of loaning a gunboat and landed Marines at Port-au-Prince, the gunboat Machias. And the Marines went to the National Bank of Haiti, a bank organized under the laws of the French government, as testified to by Roger L. Farnham. The Marines were landed without notice to the Haitian government, and the Marines were marched up to the front door of the bank and were there given $500,000 in gold belonging to the Haitian government, which was deposited in this bank as a security against its issues of notes, that being a part of the reserves in the bank under the Treaty of 1910. Here's witness Pierre Houdecourt, who in 1916 would go on to be part of a Haitian government commission looking into the banking matters between New York and Haiti. Deponent, meaning Pierre Houdecourt, was in the city of Port-au-Prince in the month of December 1914, and on or about the 13th day of December 1914, United States Marines were landed from the USS Machias. Said Marines in uniform and armed proceeded to the building occupied by the Banque Nationale de Haiti and there received $500,000 in gold, which said Marines then and there transported through the streets of Port-au-Prince between 12 noon and 2 p.m. of the said day to the wharf and thence loaded the same on board the USS Machias. On the same day, the government of Haiti instituted a formal investigation and complaint against the bank for delivery of the said gold, the property of the Haitian government, held in trust by the bank as a security for paper money then in circulation. So how about that? The Marines marched right into the bank and took $500,000 in gold, marched it right back through the streets of Port-au-Prince and onto their ship, and sent it to the National City Bank of New York, today known as Citibank. And who was running the National City Bank of New York at the time? James Stillman, who was longtime president and chairman of the bank since 1891. And at that time, the National City Bank of New York was the largest bank in the United States, and also did the banking for the Rockefeller Standard Oil. And not only that, James Stillman's two daughters were married to Rockefellers, with Sarah Elizabeth Stillman marrying William Goodsell Rockefeller, and Isabel Goodrich Stillman marrying Percy Rockefeller, both William Rockefeller's sons. And how about that William Rockefeller? As we saw in Part 1, Chapter 5 of this series, his daughter married Marcellus Hartley Dodge Sr., who owned Remington Arms, and would see William Rockefeller himself owning part of the company along with Dodge. Anyways, I have to say I was a little surprised to find this about the gold heist on the US government's website. From the Office of the Historian, in 1914 the Wilson administration sent US Marines into Haiti. They removed $500,000 from the Haitian National Bank in December of 1914 for safekeeping in New York, thus giving the United States control of the bank. And then, on July 28, 1915, another Haitian president, President Sam, whose name I'm not even going to try and pronounce, was assassinated, and President Wilson sent in the Marines, again. And 13 days later, on August 10, 1915, Smedley Butler lands in Haiti. And on November 17, 1915, Smedley Butler will lead a company of Marines to Fort Riviere, a stronghold of the Cocos rebels in northern Haiti. We find the story printed a month after, on December 24, 1915. by the capture and destruction of Fort Riviere, an old stone structure held by superstitious Haitians as impregnable and favored of the revolutionary gods. The rebellious Caicos of northern Haiti were crushed, and the pacification work of the United States Marine Corps in that section of the turbulent little island was finished. Not an American Marine was injured in the undertaking, according to the official reports just received at headquarters of the Marine Corps. Fort Riviere was built by the French when Haiti was a colonial possession of that country and has been the headquarters of the Caicos bandits for years. It has always been a hotbed of revolution, and Marine Corps officers realized that it would have to be captured and destroyed before lasting peace could come to that section. Major Smedley Darlington Butler led the expedition against Riviere, and to the 5th Company under Captain William W.O.L was assigned the task of making the main or frontal attack. This company deployed at a distance of about 1,200 yards from the fort and advanced upon it in an extended order. The Caicos fire was continuous, but the aim of the attacking party of Marines was so deadly that they were enabled in a very short time to get into position from which the fort could be stormed. With characteristic dash, they were upon the works, and although the Caicos stuck to their guns until the Marines had actually entered the fort, they were unable to inflict a single casualty in the ranks of the sea soldiers. Major Butler then ordered the fort dynamited, and when the last stones of the old structure were destroyed, the revolutionary hopes and ambitions of the North Haiti Caicos were buried beneath the ruins of Riviere. Now we'll fast forward to May 26, 1917, and we see Smedley Butler would get his second Medal of Honor for his actions at Fort Riviere. And here's the citation that goes with it. And now, with the United States having just entered World War I, Smedley Butler was hoping to be posted overseas in Europe. But, almost a year later, in March of 1918, this still hadn't happened. Lieutenant Colonel S.D. Butler, Hell Devil of the Marine Corps, who wants to be relieved of his command as governor of the island of Haiti, so as to see active service in France. He is now at his home in Westchester on furlough. And notice they called him the governor of the island of Haiti. And of course Smedley Butler was never the governor of Haiti, but I guess with limited printing space that's easier than explaining to readers what a gendarmerie is. And while Smedley Butler was back home on furlough for some much needed R&R, looking back into the 1922 inquiry into the occupation of Haiti, we see a letter dated March 6, 1918 from the President of Haiti to Smedley Butler. I feel a sincere pleasure at the time of your return to the United States to send you a testimony of my deep satisfaction for the cooperation which you have given the government of Haiti in its work of peace and progress. I explain to myself and fully understand how necessary to your health is a diversion after the long labors to which you have submitted yourself since your arrival in Haiti. So that's a ringing endorsement from the President of Haiti. And they both already knew that Smedley Butler's time in Haiti was at an end, as we can see from this letter from the Department of State to the Secretary of the Navy dated April 27, 1918, the week before the Haitian President wrote to Smedley Butler. The department has received your letter of April 23, 1918, requesting that the President of Haiti be informed of the nomination by the President of the United States for appointment by the President of Haiti, in accordance with the terms of Article 10 of the Treaty between the United States and Haiti of September 1915, and the Act of Congress concerning the Haitian Constabulary approved June 12, 1916. Major Alexander S. Williams to be Chief of the Gendarmerie de Haiti. Vice Lieutenant Colonel Smedley D. Butler, detached. In acknowledging this letter and returning the enclosure to the same, it is requested that Lieutenant Colonel Butler be informed of the appreciation which the Department of State feels regarding the excellent manner in which he performed his duties as Chief of the Gendarmerie de Haiti, and that the Department believes that Lieutenant Colonel Butler has contributed in a large measure to the success of the United States in its efforts to assist Haiti in that country's rehabilitation. And Smedley Butler's time as the Chief of the Gendarmerie in Haiti would officially end on May 1, 1918. And now that he's officially free from his duties in Haiti, 12 days later on May 12, 1918, we see General Lejeune has been in charge of the Marine training camp at Quantico, Virginia. He will be succeeded there by Colonel Smedley D. Butler, who commanded the Marines in Haiti during the recent disorders there. General Lejeune has been mentioned as prospective commander of the full division of Marines to be organized in France. So instead of going to Europe as he was hoping, Smedley Butler was posted to Quantico to take over for the guy who was being sent over to Europe. A couple of months later, in July of 1918, the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, would take in a tour of the base at Quantico. And I'll bet privately Smedley Butler was bending Secretary Daniels' ear a little bit to be sent to Europe. And 2 months later, on September 7th, 1918, Secretary Daniels is making a presentation to Smedley Butler's regiment, who are now being sent to France. So finally, Smedley Butler is on his way to World War I. Except, the war would come to an end before Smedley Butler's regiment could be deployed to the battlefield. But, during his time in France, he played a major role in a couple of crucial things, one of which would come into play years later, which we'll eventually get to. But first, although they didn't see combat action after arriving in France, Smedley Butler's regiment jumped into the task of being like a MASH unit and filling in for the service of supply troops as the 1918 flu was ravaging the world. Brigadier General George H. Harris, commanding Base Section No. 5 in France, has written a letter giving the highest praise to the regiment and to its commander, Colonel, now Brigadier General, Smedley D. Butler. Arriving in France at a time when influenza was raging among the SOS troops, the 13th turned in with a will, doing the work of men who were laid low by the plague, assisting in the care of victims and affording them amusement. The other thing Smedley Butler did was to completely transform the conditions of Camp Pontonezen, a camp in Brest, France that over 2 million US troops would spend time at when they both entered the war and would go through again to go home after the war. Before Smedley Butler was assigned command, the conditions at Camp Pontonezen were terrible, and it was little more than a bunch of flimsy buildings and tents and fields of mud, making simple things like even just going to the mess hall for a meal not only a chore, but also dangerous sometimes, especially in the rain. And the couple of million troops that were destined to return home through it weren't looking forward to their stay there again while waiting to leave France. But thanks to Smedley Butler, they were pleasantly surprised to see a huge change in conditions. And we can see in March of 1919, Secretary Daniels would take a tour of the camp. Secretary of the Navy Daniels has put his okay on the debarkation camp here. After a detailed investigation during which he visited the quarters of the Americans, sat on their bunks, took lunch with them, and for a day was one of them, he declared that, "If the mothers of America could have been with me yesterday and today, they would have been happy that their sons had such leaders as Major E.A. Helmick and Brigadier General Smedley D. Butler." So that's some pretty hefty praise. And to give you an idea of some of the transformation of Camp Pontonezen while under Smedley Butler's command, we see in May of 1919, the American embarkation camp at Pontonezen near Brest, which was so harshly criticized 3 months ago, has blossomed into the biggest camp in the world, and the critics are put to rout, Captain Edward D. Topin informs Governor Davis. New roads have been made and new boardwalks are everywhere. The camp is being christened the Duckboard Camp since the day that General Butler, the commanding officer of the camp, carried a duckboard on his back from the docks to the camp just to show the men how to do it, and was almost arrested by an MP who could not see the general underneath the duckboard for blocking the way of the general's automobile immediately behind. There are now more than 66 miles of duckboard walks. The insignia of the camp is the duckboard, and the camp newspaper is called the Pontonezen Duckboard. The following figures give some idea of the enormous growth of the camp during the month of March. The average capacity of the camp is now 80,000 men, 20,000 permanent and 60,000 transient troops. The camp contains about 1,100 buildings. Of these, 450 are barracks, each holding 6 men. Each soldier is provided with a bed and a mattress. Every tent in barracks contains 1 or more stoves, of which there were about 9,000 in all. So the changes were significant, and one of the episodes that the troops absolutely loved, so the story goes, is that when Smedley Butler took command, he had had enough of wading through the red tape to get the boardwalks installed. So he took a group of Marines to the supply depot, broke in, took a bunch of duckboard he'd been requesting, and marched it back 4 miles to Camp Pontezenon and installed it, thus earning a new nickname, General Duckboard. And for his efforts and actions in transforming Camp Pontezenon, Smedley Butler's popularity among the troops skyrocketed. At the end of June 1919, Smedley Butler would be part of an entourage that would see President Wilson off to board the battleship USS George Washington after a round of peace talks in Paris. And from the Pontezenon Duckboard on August 2nd, 1919, we see General Butler gives farewell address to permanent personnel. In January of 1920, Smedley Butler would be awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal for his actions at Camp Pontezenon, and here's the citation that goes with it. And he was also awarded the Army Distinguished Service Medal for the same. Now fast forward a couple of years, and in March of 1922, we see this. Nearly all of the 2 million members of the AEF, which is the American Expeditionary Force, meaning the Army in World War I, who passed through Brest on their way home will feel a personal interest in news concerning Brigadier General Smedley D. Butler of the Marine Corps. And basically, Smedley Butler was ill in what turned out to be stress and being overworked. And a couple of months later, in July of 1922, we can see him back on his feet again, pictured here with President Harding and General Lejeune watching the Marines recreating Gettysburg battles in a public relations campaign for the Marines. Now remember when Smedley Butler was the Gendarmerie of Haiti, or the Chief of Police in other words, and he was in charge of all the policing of the entire country of Haiti? Well, after being back in charge of the Marine camp in Quantico since leaving France, in December of 1923, Smedley Butler would go on to Philadelphia to run the city's police force. Brigadier General Smedley D. Butler, in command of the Marine Corps base at Quantico, will assume the post of Director of Public Safety in Philadelphia for 1 year, under an order issued by President Coolidge granting him a leave of absence for that period. This announcement yesterday by Secretary Demby brought to a conclusion the strenuous efforts of certain groups in Philadelphia to have the noted Marine officer undertake to solve the lawless situation in the Quaker City, which was described to President Coolidge last week by Mayor-elect Kendrick as serious. 8 months into his term as top cop of Philadelphia in August of 1924, we see in the headlines how General Butler is ridding Philadelphia of booze and vice. Students of human nature who contend there is no such thing as honest law enforcement look with skepticism upon the claim of General Smedley Butler, Philadelphia Director of Public Safety, that he has 1,600 policemen who are not taking bribes and who are actually enforcing the laws. When he took office last January, he gave orders for a cleanup. The men thought he meant it to just the extent all his predecessors had meant it. They were wrong. Where there were 32 disorderly houses raided in June of last year, there were 55 raided this June under Butler's orders. Where 18 speakeasies fell before the law last June, there were 222 casualties this corresponding month. Those are just examples from a long list. And after a pretty successful first year in 1924, Smedley Butler's role in leading Philadelphia's police force would be extended for another year in 1925. And in early January of 1925, instead of little speakeasies and brothels being busted, we see the Ritz-Carlton getting busted. And we can see Magistrate Carney, who made the bust, saying, "The Ritz Hotel is not the only hotel I'm after. General Butler has an affidavit in his possession, in which it is charged that a well-known society woman gave a banquet at the Bellevue Stratford, at which from 20 to 40 cases of wine and liquor were served. If Mayor Kendrick is on the level in padlocking all these cases, let him include the Bellevue and the Ritz too, and not pick on the others." And this chapter of Smedley Butler's life reminds me of the television series Boardwalk Empire, which takes place in the Prohibition era of the 1920s, mostly in Atlantic City, and where many of the scenes take place in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel that also openly served alcohol. The television series revolved around the fictional character of Enoch Nucky Thompson, Atlantic City Treasurer, who was based on the real-life Enoch Nucky Johnson, who was equally as corrupt in real life. The show also introduces the viewers to the rise of legendary names like Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, and Mayor Lansky, with some historical accuracy here and there as well, and I do emphasize here and there. And like the character of Nucky Thompson being based on the actual real-life Nucky Johnson, we see a gang of bootleggers and cutthroats from Philadelphia called the D'Alessio Brothers, who are based on the real-life Lanzetti brothers out of Philadelphia. And if we look ahead to when Lanzetti brother William was shot and killed, we see one of his brothers, Leo, was shot in South Philadelphia in August of 1925, which is when and where Smedley Butler had been ramping up enforcement, as we'll see in a minute. But something struck me while researching this era in general. The 1920s and 30s gave rise to the era of the American gangster, and you can kind of look at them in two categories. The gangsters who did the bootlegging and had speakeasies, brothels, loan sharking operations, and so on. And then there's the gangsters whose notoriety mostly came from bank robberies. And what I find interesting is that the ones doing the bootlegging were sometimes also at war with each other, where murders and blowing up cars and speakeasies were becoming common. Meanwhile, the ones that were robbing banks were hunted down and shot by authorities. So don't mess with the banks. Remember, they nabbed Al Capone on taxes, and Luciano and Lansky and others would go on to form what would become the Mafia. Anyways, that all goes beyond Smedley Butler, but he did have a Ritz-Carlton and Lanzetti brothers to deal with. And looking at the murder of Leo Lanzetti, who was gunned down outside his bar in a gang hit, we see the month before, in July of 1925, Brigadier General Smedley Butler, Philadelphia Public Safety Commissioner, started a new vice and booze cleanup, threatening to discharge the entire police force if it failed. Nearing the end of his second year on the job, in October of 1925, we see plea for Butler goes to Coolidge. 30,000 God-fearing, Constitution-respecting, decent people of Pennsylvania are ready to lay aside business ties and come to Washington to plead in person for the retention of Brigadier General Smedley D. Butler as the head of the Police Department of Philadelphia, Governor Pynchon told President Coolidge today. Governor Pynchon came to Washington for the express purpose of asking the President, in the name of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, to grant the Marine Corps commander another year's extension of his leave of absence, that he may be allowed to finish the job that he has so well begun. In a long statement following the conference, Governor Pynchon declared that the removal of General Butler at this time would be a blow to law and order. And then we see on November 6, 1925, while President Coolidge at the White House was dictating his letter refusing to extend the leave of Brigadier General Smedley D. Butler for another year in order that he might continue his cleanup of Philadelphia, the Republican organization which dominates that city was demonstrating why the God-fearing people of Pennsylvania thought it necessary for Butler to continue. Philadelphia is ruled by the machine headed by Congressman William S. F.D.R. The F.D.R. organization is hard-boiled, resourceful, cold-blooded. It knows nothing of sentiment. John M. Patterson, one of F.D.R.'s people, a popular jurist, had been nominated for district attorney. He was taken ill a few days before the election, and on election day took a sudden turn for the worse. He died that night. When the news of his sinking spread over Philadelphia on Tuesday, there were general sorrow, but not at the F.D.R. headquarters. There, F.D.R. and his associates were issuing orders to carry out a piece of cold, carefully considered political business. Death threatened their control of the district attorney's office, and it was necessary for heroic measures. It was no time for tears. Messengers were rushed from headquarters with bundles of stickers containing the name of another candidate. While Patterson was dying, the machine was making a last-minute effort to elect a live man in his stead. Death was to be cheated. It was a grim job, and the Scheuer stickers were pasted on ballots by the thousands. Had the news spread earlier in the day, he would have been overwhelmingly elected. In his work at Philadelphia, General Butler time and again has stepped on the toes of the F.D.R. forces. He fired their personal policemen and broke their control over the police department. The politicians want the police back in their hands. President Coolidge's actions will serve their purpose. Looking ahead 3 weeks, on November 26, 1925, we see Mayor Kendrick of Philadelphia has asked President Coolidge to permit Brigadier General Smedley D. Butler of the Marine Corps to remain as Philadelphia's Director of Safety. But unlike Governor Pinchot's plea to President Coolidge for Smedley Butler to stay on in the job, Mayor Kendrick's request was totally BS and only meant for public consumption, and Smedley Butler's next actions would show that. Because President Coolidge wasn't going to extend Smedley Butler's leave to continue serving as Philadelphia's top cop, we see on December 22, 1925, Smedley Butler quit the Marines so he could stay on in Philadelphia. But an hour after quitting the Marines, Mayor Hendricks fired Smedley Butler. Brigadier General Smedley D. Butler today announced he had resigned from the Marine Corps in order to remain in Philadelphia as Director of Public Safety, and an hour later Mayor Hendricks made known he would not accept the general in the position as a resigned officer of the Marine Corps. The general was called into conference with the mayor after his resignation became known. When he left the mayor's office, the general hurried to his own room and announced the mayor had refused to accept me as a resigned officer of the Marine Corps. "Then you don't want me?" Butler said he asked the mayor. "Not as a resigned officer," he quoted the mayor as saying. "Now we see who is being smoked out," General Butler said. The next day, on December 23, 1925, we see Smedley Butler would return to the Marine Corps. And we can see Smedley Butler's opinion of Philadelphia, where he says, "I'm going to my home in Overbrook, and I'm going to drive there in a car of the United States Marine Corps. The Marines can take care of me, and I'd rather be in the Marine Corps than in 15 million cities like Philadelphia." The mayor's letter of dismissal was as follows: "Your letter of December 22nd inquiring why I would request your resignation and would relieve you from duty is received. I am not required by law to give a reason for dismissal of a director. In order to comply with your request, I may say that you have not a proper appreciation of the obligation which you hold to the mayor as your superior officer." And having a look at part of Smedley Butler's response, we see, "You have not interfered in the enforcement of law against the powerless violators or those in whom you are not interested," General Butler wrote. "But when you balked and directed your city solicitor not to proceed with the padlock proceedings against the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, against which establishment there was as much and as vicious evidence as against any of the other places we have closed, and when you refused to revoke the dance license of the big hotels such as the Ritz-Carlton, the Walton, and the Bellevue Stratford, controlled by your friends on evidence as damaging as has caused revocation of many other licenses, all of which action was urgently recommended by me, and when on December 21st I again pressed you to act and indicated that I would find other means of doing so if you did not act, you on December 22nd dismissed me from office." So like I say, Philadelphia of the 1920s reminds me of Atlantic City and Boardwalk Empire. And it's easy to understand Mayor Kendrick's actions when you consider that he and William V.E.R. were good friends. With the fiasco in Philadelphia now at an end, in January of 1926, Smedley Butler would take command of the Marine Corps base at San Diego. And a couple months later, in March of 1926, Smedley Butler would report a Marine that was serving liquor at a dinner hosted in Smedley Butler's honor. And this episode would explode in the newspapers in the months that followed. And it's not that Smedley Butler made a big deal of it, the newspapers did. Remember, this was right on the heels of Smedley Butler's very public 2 years in Philadelphia, heavily trying to enforce the prohibition laws, on top of all the policing of the city as well. And I'm not sure what Colonel Alexander Williams, who hosted the night, was thinking, but he might as well have busted out a pile of cocaine while he was at it. He put Smedley Butler in the position of either having to report him, or being called a hypocrite for not doing so. Anyways, moving along, 9 months later in January of 1927, we see trouble brewing in Nicaragua again. Orders to organize a standby battalion ready to proceed anywhere at a moment's notice were received by Lieutenant Colonel William H. Pritchett, acting commander of the San Diego Marine Base. The battalion consists of 288 men under command of Major Alexander A. Vandergrift. Orders for the formation of the battalion came from Brigadier General Smedley D. Butler, in charge of the Marine Corps of the Western Mail Guard. Remember, in 1909 we first saw Smedley Butler and the Marines sent into Nicaragua, and U.S. Marines were stationed there since, forming and training the Nicaraguan National Guard. And we can see in 1926, The Nicaraguan National Guard and Army seemed to be easily defeating the rebel forces trying to take over. Until January 1927, that is. And that's pretty interesting. A Nicaraguan rebel force seizes a town on January 8th, and the Marines in San Diego were mobilized on January 10th. And don't forget, as we saw earlier, all throughout this time period, Wall Street bankers, Brown Brothers, are heavily involved in Nicaragua's banking system. And now here's what's really interesting. We've seen how Guantanamo Bay and U.S. ownership over it began, and we saw how the Republic of Panama was created and how U.S. control of the Panama Canal began. And now this is literally when and where the 1980s Iran-Contra scandal actually begins. And of course we'll get into Iran-Contra in a later chapter of this series, but its direct roots very much indeed begin at this point in time. With Nicaragua again facing civil war, the U.S. Marines are now there to help the Nicaraguan government side, and we see on July 1st, 1927, American gold mine seized in Nicaragua. And I find that headline pretty interesting in itself. Like, what's an American gold mine doing all the way down in Nicaragua? I wonder how the owner, Charles Butters, was able to transport and install his American gold mine into the Nicaraguan soil. Of course, I'm just being a smartass here, but it looks like Charles Butters is just another example of an American Wall Street connected elite that's bent on making a fortune by sucking out the resources of another poorer country. But unfortunately for him, Augusto Sandino has had enough. A repercussion of the recently ended civil war in Nicaragua has developed in the seizure of an American-owned gold mine, San Albino, in the district of Nueva Segovia by the former Liberal General Augusto Sandino. Charles Butters, owner of the mine, in which he is said to have invested more than $700,000, has requested immediate protection for his property by the American government through American Minister Eberhard. Butters is returning from Managua to his mine, despite the belief that he may be at risk of his life. General Sandino's avowed purpose in seizing the property is said to be to destroy American influence. A couple weeks later, on July 17, 1927, we see Nicaraguan rebel defies U.S. Marines. General Sandino, former liberal who has been occupying American mines at San Fernando, has informed Major D.G. Hadfield, commanding a detachment of United States Marines at El Cotal, that he will not surrender. Your communication has been received and understood, General Sandino said in reply to the demand for his surrender. I will not surrender and will await you here. I want a free country or death. I have no fear and rely on the bravery and patriotism of my followers. The Marine detachment was reported to be proceeding toward General Sandino's headquarters with a detachment of Nicaraguan soldiers. It is believed here that the former Liberal general will evacuate when the joint forces approach, despite his refusal to surrender. 2 days later, on July 19, 1927, we see Sandino outlawed, Secretary of State Frank Kellogg declares. General Sandino and his Nicaraguan followers who clashed yesterday with American Marines at El Cotal are in effect nothing more than outlaws, Secretary Kellogg declared in a letter last night to William Greene, President of the American Federation of Labor. And Secretary of State Kellogg also says that Sandino is a bandit. But keep in mind, Sandino's not there to steal any gold. He's there, in his view, to stop others, meaning the U.S., from stealing what he views as Nicaragua's gold. And Secretary of State Frank Kellogg, to me anyways, looks so much like one of the Duke brothers in the 1983 Eddie Murphy movie, Trading Places, that subconsciously I automatically view Kellogg as a bad guy. So there's that too. Hell, he's even got the same haircut. Here's an intelligence report from November of 1927 from the Marine Commander to the National Guard Director. And in it he writes under a section titled, Attitude of Civil Population Toward Forces. And in El Cotal, friendly in public, privately at least half the population are friendly to Sandino, liberal, or Anastasia Hernandez, leader of the conservative bandits, and could not be trusted in the least in the case of attack. And looking on page 2 of the report, he writes about a magazine out of Honduras that supports Sandino, reporting, this publication, combined with the utterly ridiculous claims and statements put out by Sandino regarding his successes in battle against the Marines in Guardia, keep the ignorant horde of Sandino's followers, childishly faithful, and they believe utterly that Sandino will drive the American forces from Nicaragua and then be the most famous personage in Nicaragua's history. And how about that? Kind of prophetic, isn't it? While Sandino didn't exactly drive the American forces out of Nicaragua, he was the catalyst for it happening. And while many in North America may not know who Augusto Sandino is, anyone from Nicaragua today will easily tell you that Sandino is indeed the most famous person in Nicaragua's history. While Sandino and his followers would continue to wage war in the following years, we see in January of 1929 that Nicaragua has a new president. General Jose Maria Moncada, in his inaugural address as president of Nicaragua yesterday, praised American supervision of the election. No doubt. And that's because, as we can see here, Moncada is the U.S. lackey. In the mediation attempts he's annoyed by are from the presidents of El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Guatemala, all weighing in on the situation in Nicaragua. And here we see, as Moncada himself was also addressed by the association, Anastasio Somoza, his secretary, yesterday replied as follows. And Anastasio Somoza, as we'll see, is most definitely favored by the U.S. big shots that are truly running the show. By 1930, they still haven't been able to stop Sandino. And by 1931, we see there was a truce in place that ended in April. And looking at the bottom paragraph, we see an unconfirmed message to the Standard Fruit Company in the Canal Zone said 500 bandits had killed 25 persons, including 10 Marines, at Bragman's Bluff, Nicaragua. So it's good that the Standard Fruit Company over in the Canal Zone in Panama are relaying communications. And it makes sense, I suppose. I mean, we all had banana phones when we were kids, right? Now it makes more sense. In 1932, we see some shuffling of President Moncada's administration, and Anastasio Somoza is now acting foreign minister, which means he'll be the one dealing with the US. And truly, dark times are upon Nicaragua, as Somoza will slowly begin the takeover of the country. But first, see Juan Sacasa there, who resigned? He was the foreign minister to the US before Somoza, though the US didn't really like him all that much. And by January of 1933, he's now the president of Nicaragua. And the Marines would be leaving Nicaragua for the first time in 19 years. The last of the United States Marines were leaving Nicaragua today, and Juan B. Sacasa became the first president in 19 years to start his term of office without their reassuring presence. An American-trained Native Guard, 2,500 strong, henceforth will have the task of patrolling this largest, but most sparsely populated Central American republic all to itself. And the head of the National Guard now is General Anastasio Somoza. The Marines have sold all their buildings to the Nicaraguan government. President Sacasa, former minister to the United States, said, "I will devote all persuasion that is compatible with national dignity to a return to the guarantees of life and property. I shall leave no stone unturned to bring that about, although it may be necessary to continue to use armed force." He made no reference to General Sandino, the insurgent leader who has threatened Nicaraguan governments for years, and whose occasional skirmishes with native guards have continued. And exactly 1 month later, on February 2nd, 1933, the news would break that Sandino and Sacasa's government have made a peace deal, ending almost 7 years of war. General Augusto Sandino, with whose forces the Nicaraguan government and the United States Marines have engaged in many combats, arrived at the presidential palace today to discuss terms under which he would make peace with the country. So it wasn't a surrender, it was a peace treaty. And these guys were all friends at one time, keep in mind. And some of the conditions of the peace treaty included Sandino to keep 100 of his men armed as protection. And this was not only protection from Nicaraguan factions with whom he had been fighting against, but also protection against some of his own factions who didn't want the peace treaty to be signed, who Sandino also agreed to help Sacasa's administration track down and capture. Another condition of the treaty we find in this report from U.S. Marine Major A.R. Harris on February 3, 1933. And he writes, Sandino signs peace agreement. Brief news dispatches from Managua state that a peace pact with Sandino was finally concluded on February 1st. Complete details of the peace pact are not as yet known. However, it is stated that one of Sandino's conditions, which was accepted, is the incorporation of a change in the Constitution to the effect that no attorney or representative of foreign companies can hold office, either in the Cabinet, Congress, or any other public office, where his private interests might conflict with his official duties. And below that we see, if the above is correct, it will mean the removal of Dr. Salvatore Guerrero Montalvan, Sacasa's Minister of the Treasury, who for years has been attorney for the United Fruit Company in Nicaragua. Well, how about that? The Marines can finally come out of Nicaragua, but United Fruit is going to run the Treasury Department. And this provision ultimately won't go into effect, as we can see here from the Foreign Relations of the United States Diplomatic Papers of 1934. In a letter sent on October 5, 1933, from U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull to the Nicaraguan chargé, W.O.L, which is pretty interesting in itself, and we'll come back to that. But in the letter we can see that Salvador Guerrero Montalvan, as of October 1933, is still the Minister of Finance of Nicaragua. And looking back to the Nicaraguan chargé d'affaires, which is kind of like the Nicaraguan Foreign Minister to the United States, we see the name W.O.L. And we also see the name W.O.L attached to the sons of Anastasio Somoza. And that's because their mother, Somoza's wife, is Salvadora W.O.L Sacasa. And she also happens to be the niece of the Nicaraguan president, Juan Sacasa. And the Nicaraguan chargé d'affaires to the United States, W.O.L, is her brother, making him Anastasio Somoza's brother-in-law. So this is all one big family affair. But remember, Juan Sacasa isn't exactly favored by the U.S. interests, mostly because he's too friendly to Augusto Sandino. But Anastasio Somoza isn't. He doesn't like Augusto Sandino at all. And going back a few months to a report sent to U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull in July of 1933 from Matthew Hanna, who was the U.S. Foreign Minister or Ambassador to Nicaragua. And he writes, I have the honor to transmit herewith, and he mentions about the report he's sending, which was prepared by the Nicaraguan National Guard. And then he writes, the report was handed to me by General Anastasia Somoza, Chief of the Guardia Nacional. On the next page he writes, General Somoza told me when he gave me this report that he was endeavoring to carry out his plan to reduce the strength of the Guardia to 2,300, but that the situation generally in the Republic, particularly in the former Bandit region, has prevented him from reducing the Guardia as rapidly as he expected. He said in this connection that he was fearful that Sandino would stir up trouble between Nicaragua and Honduras. It will be noted that Sandino's 100 armed men are not included in the accompanying consolidated report. So we can easily see that Anastasio Somoza is making sure the U.S. knows that he's quite removed from anything to do with Augusto Sandino. Now fast forward 8 months to February 1934, and it's been 1 year since Sandino and Sacasa signed the peace treaty, and things for the most part anyways have been going relatively smooth. Sandino and Sacasa are friendly towards each other, and no one's trying to wage war against each other, and Sandino and his entourage have been staying in the capital to hammer out the final details of the overall peace treaty with Sacasa. After leaving a meeting one night, Sandino and his brother were purposely shot and killed by the Nicaraguan National Guard. General Augustus Sandino, famous rebel, was killed with his brother Socrates Sandino and 2 friends by National Guardsmen at midnight on the outskirts of Managua, a government communique indicated. The government statement read, the government officially states that the action of the Guardia Nacional in killing Sandino was contrary to the instruction of President Sacasa to guarantee the lives of Sandino and his followers while they were in Managua. So if President Sacasa didn't order the assassination, who do you think did? And we'll get to that in a minute, but we see the next day on February 23, 1934. Augusto Sandino's father, who was with his sons right up until the National Guard hauled them away, spoke about what happened. Signor Gregorio Sandino, father of the general and one of the last to see him alive, gave his version of events preceding the shooting in an interview at the presidential palace where he is a guest. The four who were killed, together with Signor Sandino and Minister of Agriculture Sophonius Salvatierra, had dinner at the Salvatierra home and returned to the palace in an automobile. At the main gate we were stopped by a guardsman, said the elder Sandino. Salvatierra, myself, and the chauffeur were requested to get out of the machine. The rest were driven to the east side of town. I'm told that upon passing Salvatierra's home, the guardsmen attempted to find and apprehend another of my son's aides, General Ferretti, who was housed there. During the commotion, a son-in-law of Salvatierra's was killed. My sons and the two others were then driven southward to a barrio, village, called La Renaja on the eastern outskirts of the city. Shortly afterwards, shots were heard and it was believed that Augusto and his companions were killed by bullets and buried there. So wow, Sandino and his entourage, including his father, brother, and Minister of Agriculture, were ambushed by the National Guard while arriving back at the presidential palace by car. And remember that point as we go. A few weeks later, on March 11th, 1934, we see there's a serious problem behind the Sandino slaying probe. And of course there is. Would you expect anything different? And that's because it was General Anastasio Somoza who ordered the assassination of Sandino. And it was National Guardsman Colonel Camilo Gonzalez who was the triggerman, who created a problem for Washington a few weeks later. State Department officials are aroused over the arrival in this country of Colonel Camilo Gonzalez, the alleged slayer of the former Nicaraguan revolutionary leader General Sandino, because of the possible complications it may create in Latin America if Gonzalez were given a haven in the United States. And upon arrival at that point, he was insisting that he didn't kill Sandino. But 2 weeks ago, in a statement given to the press in Costa Rica, where he arrived from Nicaragua after having obtained an American immigration visa, Gonzalez boasted that he had killed Sandino at the express order of the commander of the Nicaraguan National Guard, Anastasio Somoza. The statement created a sensation in Latin America, not because Gonzalez was an assassin, but because he had killed the Nicaraguan revolutionary leader at the instigation of the chief of the National Guard, which was trained by the American Marines. And Anastasio Somoza's takeover of the country, while U.S. interests approvingly looked on, would continue unabated. The next day, on April 4th, 1934, we see in the headlines, Nicaraguan president held prisoner by army leader. Dr. Pedro Jose Zepeda, who announced himself as the leader of the Nicaraguan faction formerly headed by the late Augusto C. Sandino, said today that President Juan B. Sacasa is a virtual prisoner in the Nicaraguan capital, Managua. Zepeda said he would lead a movement against General Anastasio Somoza, commander of the National Guard, whom he described as holding sway over the president. Dr. Sacasa is virtually a prisoner in Managua at the mercy of General Somoza, said Zepeda. He is unable to take any action to bring to justice the assassins of General Sandino, because Somoza controls most of the armed forces in the country, and it was Somoza who ordered the killing of Sandino. And through 1934 and 1935, U.S. interests, including the State Department, would watch as the U.S.-trained Nicaraguan National Guard, led by Anastasio Somoza, would gradually take over the country, while detailing the rift between President Sacasa and General Somoza as a breach between them. But notice there's no sending of the Marines in this time to help a besieged Nicaraguan president. On June 2, 1936, we see soldiers put down revolt in Nicaragua. General Anastasio Somoza, commanding the National Guard, said today his men controlled the entire country in their rebellion against the decision by the two chief political parties to support a joint ticket in the presidential elections. President Juan B. Sacasa remained besieged in his La Loma palace here, guarded by loyal guardsmen and civilians against Somozistas under General Moncada, former president. And, let's see, by December of 1936, Anastasio Somoza is the boss of Nicaragua. And together with his two sons, he would rule Nicaragua for the next 43 years with an iron fist. Here and there they'd appoint a puppet president for various reasons. But after 43 years of oppression and dictatorship, the people of Nicaragua would go into revolution, and overthrow the Somoza dynasty in 1979. And leading the fight against Somoza in 1979 was the FSLN, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, or the Sandinista National Liberation Front, more commonly called Sandinistas. And of course they named themselves that in memory of Augusto Sandino. And remember how Augusto Sandino was killed, ambushed in a car, and shot and killed on the orders of Anastasio Somoza? Well, on August 21st, 1979, Anastasio Somoza Debayle would flee Nicaragua to Paraguay. And a year later, in September of 1980, he was tracked down by the Sandinistas and killed, ambushed in a car. And notice how when the Sandinistas take out Somoza in 1980, ambushing him in a car and killing him, the Sandinistas are labeled as terrorists, while 36 years earlier, when Somoza ordered his National Guard to take out Sandino, who then ambushed Sandino in a car and killed him, it's Sandino who gets the label still as well. A rebel, a bandit, and so on. Anyways, with the Nicaraguan Revolution in 1979 and the killing of Somoza in September of 1980, followed by the election of Reagan-Bush in November of 1980, the stage was set and it was game on for Iran-Contra. And like we've seen so far, with the beginnings of Guantanamo Bay and the US control of the Panama Canal, we see Smedley Butler involved at the very roots of the 1980s Iran-Contra scandal as well. First, when sent down to Nicaragua in 1909, as he would later put it, to help purify Nicaragua for the Brown Brothers banking firm. But the more direct connections overall to Iran-Contra really begin in 1927, and Smedley Butler's involvement, as we saw, included sending a Marine battalion down to Nicaragua in January of 1927, on presidential orders of course. He didn't go down there himself through this period. And by July of 1927, as we saw, Augusto Sandino would seize the gold mine, and his Sandinista rebel army would begin a 6-year campaign against U.S. occupation of Nicaragua, and Wall Street interests taking massive natural resources out of the country, as well as controlling Nicaragua's finances. And another connection we see, and quite the coincidence, is that in 1930, Brown Brothers and Company would merge with W.A. Harriman and Company to form Brown Brothers Harriman and Company. And with Prescott Bush, George H.W.'s father, as a full founding partner of the newly merged company, he would have a share of the controlling interests of anything involved with Nicaragua from the previous Brown Brothers and Company entity. And I'll bet, had Prescott Bush lived long enough, he would have been proud of his son George H.W. Bush's efforts during Iran-Contra. Anyways, as we saw, in 1934, Sandino was killed on the orders of Anastasio Somoza. And by 1936, Somoza takes over the country, and together with his sons, they rule Nicaragua for the next 43 years, until the Sandinistas storm back in 1979, setting the stage for Iran-Contra, which we'll take a deep look into later on in this series. But now you know the roots of it and where it began. And as we saw, Smedley Butler created a battalion to send to Nicaragua in January of 1927, but he himself didn't know this time. And also in January of 1927, we see trouble brewing again in China. And by February, things are intensifying as the Cantonese army continues moving towards Shanghai. And by March of 1927, Smedley Butler would be heading back to China again to lead the Marines. Only this time, they would be stationed right beside the huge Standard Oil refinery, pictured here. And it's a good thing too, as on December 24th, 1927, whether through accident or sabotage, it was never determined, but the refinery went up in flames. The Tianjin plant of the Standard Oil Company of New York caught fire at 11:30 this morning. It was feared the plant, the largest in northern China, would be a total loss. The plant, with the stocks of oil on hand, has an estimated value of $25 million. It is situated across a narrow river from the foreign settlement. The plant includes 6 3-million-gallon tanks, The fear was expressed that these might explode and cause widespread destruction. The cause of the fire was not determined. And as you can see, this was quite the fire. But as I say, it's a good thing the Marines were right there, as they would help as the fire raged on. And here's Smedley Butler looking on. And ultimately, after a couple of days of firefighting, on December 26, 1927, we see Marines subdue oil fire in China. Butler leads troops in fight to save $25 million plant at Tientsin. And with that battle being won, that would constitute the biggest battle during his time in China the second time around. As we'd see in February of 1929, Smedley Butler would say his time in China was too tame. "We didn't fire a shot," says noted Marine returning from the Orient. "We didn't fire a shot," General Butler said before he left here for the East. "It's the first expedition I ever went on that was so tame." So we didn't fire a shot this time around in China. But fast forward to the end of the year in December of 1929, and would see Smedley Butler start firing off plenty of shots. Verbal shots, that is, as we see the beginnings of the next phase of Smedley Butler's career, which would involve a number of speeches and written works that would land him in hot water with the powers that be. And on December 5th, 1929, while making a speech in Pittsburgh, he had some pretty interesting things to say about Nicaragua. He was quoted as saying regarding the Nicaraguan election that the opposition candidates became bandits when it became necessary to elect our man to office. And with so many Nicaraguan presidents, it can be a little bit confusing, but the one he's talking about is Jose Moncada. And remember when we saw earlier as Smedley Butler was the Gendarmerie of Haiti? Well, apparently in the same speech, regarding Haiti, Butler told how the Marine-controlled president had dissolved the Congress to prevent the legislative body from passing a new constitution. He aided the president in drawing up the edict that dissolved the Congress. A year later, on January 29, 1931, Smedley Butler would get court-martialed over comments he made in a speech. And the US government would make a public apology to Italy's fascist leader, Benito Mussolini. And what happened with Smedley Butler during a speech he was making relayed a story he had heard told previously in a speech by an unnamed person in November of 1930. Unnamed meaning Smedley Butler didn't say who it was that originally told the story. And that story tells that Mussolini, while driving his car with this unnamed person as a passenger in 1926, took a turn in the road and ran over a little girl who had run out onto the road. And apparently when the unnamed person turned around while looking back in shock, Mussolini turned to him and nonchalantly said something along the lines of, "What's one life in the affairs of a state?" and kept on driving. The next day, January 30th, 1931, we see, as an aftermath of yesterday's developments, two questions yet unanswered have arisen. First, who told Butler about the hit-and-run tale about Mussolini, which he related before the Contemporary Club in Philadelphia? Second, did the White House director approve the note to Italy and Butler's court-martial? Both are answered by reports current in Washington, but neither has official confirmation. According to these reports, Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr. was the source of the story that Mussolini, driving through Italy in a fast car, ran down a child, then observed lightly, "What is one life in the affairs of a state?" Vanderbilt has declined either to affirm or deny report. And Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr., if you're wondering, is the nephew of Alfred Vanderbilt, who we saw in the World of Lies chapter on the Lusitania. The next day, on January 31st, 1931, we see General Butler's trial to climax spectacular career of valor. So after nearly 33 years of fighting as a Marine, honored twice with the Congressional Medal, distinguished by deeds of exceptional valor in almost every clime, Major General Smedley Darlington Butler is under technical arrest at his Quantico, Virginia Marine Base, awaiting court-martial for alleged remarks held by this government to have been an unwarranted reflection upon Prime Minister Mussolini of Italy. And that's not all. General Butler has been relieved of his command and now must wait for the spectacular climax of his long drama. Then, 9 days later on February 9th, 1931, we see Secretary of the Navy Charles Adams calls off Butler's trial, but gives reprimand, and no explanation given. And on the same day, we see Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr. finally weighs in. If the newspapers really want to run this down, why don't they find out what some others said there, asked the young publisher. Informed of the cancellation of the court-martial ordered for General Butler, young Vanderbilt expressed himself as being glad of it. Vanderbilt never has told the story behind the Mussolini hit-and-run anecdote, as related by the Marine Corps officer. I was offered to appear at his trial and tell my version of the story from the witness stand, he said. If it is a closed incident with the government, it is a closed incident with me too. And with Vanderbilt's personal little Me Too movement, he still hasn't revealed what exactly happened in the incident. But on February 12, 1931, we see Cornelius Vanderbilt threatening to sue Smedley Butler. The Butler court-martial may be at an end in Washington, Vanderbilt was quoted as saying, but as far as I'm concerned, there are still a lot of other things to be cleared up, including the statement attributed to me by Butler over the so-called Mussolini hit-and-run episode. The incident which General Butler incorrectly described came about in the following manner. I was riding with Mussolini, who was driving his car. At a sharp jog on the road, a small child ran in front of the machine and was hit. I looked back to see if the child had been hurt, and as I did so, Mussolini placed his hand on my knee, and these were his very words. "Never look back, Mr. Vanderbilt. Always look ahead in life." So Cornelius Vanderbilt took exception that Smedley Butler didn't quote him perfectly. But I'm glad he did, because now we know what Mussolini actually said to him. "Never look back, Mr. Vanderbilt. Always look ahead in life." And it's not the actual hit-and-run incident itself, or even Mussolini's casual attitude that struck me about this particular episode in history. After all, Mussolini's from a different time. Want to talk about old school? Over 100 years ago, a young Mussolini would settle his differences with old-school duels, using swords and pistols. And considering what Mussolini turned into, I'm not surprised that he ran over a little girl and kept on driving. And of course, he would deny the incident never happened, or even that he ever drove any American visitor around the Italian countryside. But decades later, this picture of Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr. in a car with Mussolini would emerge from the Vanderbilt family archives. And also the Italian government would finally release documentation of the 1926 meeting with Mussolini and Vanderbilt as well. But what strikes me is what he said to Vanderbilt. 3 words in particular: never look back. Because here's the leader of a country with a crime literally right behind him, where he could have stopped and did something about it, but kept on going. Because never look back. And why do I find those 3 words from Mussolini about the topic of criminal behavior so fascinating? Let's fast forward to January 11th, 2009, and in an interview with then-President-elect Barack Obama on ABC This Week, George Stephanopoulos asked Obama about whether his administration would look into some of the war crimes of the previous Bush administration.
Will you appoint a special prosecutor, ideally Patrick Fitzgerald, to independently investigate the gravest crimes of the Bush administration, including torture and warrantless wiretapping?
We're still evaluating how we are going to approach the whole issue of interrogations, detentions, and so forth. And obviously we're going to be looking at past practices. And I don't believe that anybody is above the law. On the other hand, I also have a belief that we need to look forward as opposed to looking backwards. And
so no 9/11 commission with independent subpoena power?
You know, we have not made final decisions, but my instinct is for us to focus on how do we make sure that moving forward we are doing the right thing. But my general belief is that when it comes to national security, what we have to focus on is getting things right in the future, as opposed to looking at what we got wrong in the past.
Yeah, what could we possibly learn from looking into our past mistakes and war crimes? Of course, this entire series is about looking back into the past to understand the present we live in today. And if you followed along so far, I'm sure you'll agree that we've learned a great deal so far, and we're truly just getting started. Now, please allow me to show my bipartisanship here and give you another example of Never Look Back from January 20th, 2017.
For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government while the people have borne the cost. Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and the factories closed. The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. Their victories have not been your victories. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs. And while they celebrated in our nation's capital, there was little to celebrate for struggling families all across our land.
I watched this live, and at this point I thought, wow, he's totally nailing it. For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government while the people have borne the cost? Are you kidding me? As we've seen in this series, this has been going on for over 100 years. There was even a Bush in the game back then, as we saw in Part 1, Chapter 10 of this series. Anyways, Trump would go on nailing it for a while, but watch what he says at the end here.
And spent trillions and trillions of dollars overseas, while America's infrastructure has fallen into disrepair and decay. We've made other countries rich, while the wealth, strength, and confidence of our country has dissipated over the horizon. One by one, the factories shuttered and left our shores, with not even a thought about the millions and millions of American workers that were left behind. The wealth of our middle class has been ripped from their homes and then redistributed all across the world. But that is the past, and now we are looking only to the future.
We are looking only to the future. Never look back. He wasn't saying that on the campaign trail.
We went after Iraq, we decimated the country, Iran's taken over, okay. But it wasn't the Iraqis. You will find out who really knocked down the World Trade Center, because they have papers in there that are very secret. You may find it's the Saudis, okay? But you will find out.
It's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Because you'd be in jail.
And we are going to drain the swamp.
You'll find out it was the Saudis, but no you won't. Or Hillary would be in jail if Trump were president, but no she won't. And if you want to argue over the finer points of whether Hillary broke the law with her email scandal, you'll find my full rebuttal in the Clinton Cash Decades of Documentarian video. And yes, I go over the Gorin case in full detail, and the Supreme Court ruling, and the actual laws, and so on. But anyways, Trump promised to drain the swamp? Well, that's kind of hard to do if you're only going to be looking to the future. Now let's back up a little bit and see who's there watching.
But that is the past. And now we are looking only to the future.
Little W, Obama, Hillary, Michelle Obama, Joe Biden, and I guess Joe was off taking a nap somewhere, or maybe he forgot what state the inauguration was taking place. And I'll bet this group, even with the looking only into the future comment, didn't think too much of Trump's inauguration speech.
For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government, while the people have borne the cost. Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left.
And of course, I'm not saying both Obama and Trump are literally Mussolinis, but I do find it very interesting and telling that all three have the same sort of outlook. The never look back, always look forward attitude when it comes to horrific and criminal actions. And we'll get to the Obama and Trump presidencies in later chapters. But back to 1931, we see a week after the Mussolini fiasco, Smedley Butler says that Al Capone should be deported. And the next day, we see a pissed off Al Capone responding, that he was born in New York and he can't be deported, which is something Smedley Butler probably didn't realize. The following month, on March 8, 1931, Smedley Butler would be in Washington, D.C., and would announce that he is about to make 20 speeches in 20 towns in 21 days. And he also said that he'd be retiring by October, and that he had signed a speaking contract. Now remember when Smedley Butler ran the Philadelphia Police Department in 1924 and 1925? Well, we see the next month, on April 24th, 1931, Smedley Butler would be released from duties for a few months to go help organize the Oregon State Police. Yep, Smedley Butler helped create the Oregon State Police. Bet most people didn't know that. We see another international incident start flaring up in the news the very next day, on April 25th, 1931. Butler hinted in fight over Haiti medal. Navy Secretary Adams has referred to the State Department a letter from Major General Smedley D. Butler, in which Butler inquires as to the course of action the government will take with regard to statements made about his record in Haiti. A recent interview with the Haitian minister, which was printed in a Washington newspaper, quoted him as saying that Fort Riviera in Haiti, where fighting occurred for which General Butler was awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor, quote, did not exist then and does not now, and that the fact is not only known to Haitians, but also is the subject both of amusement and indignation, end quote. When the interview with the Haitian minister first was called to Butler's attention, he proposed to laugh it off as being unworthy of comment, friends here said. But his friends, both in civilian and military life, urged him to request an explanation, it was said, not only for his own sake, but for the honor of the numerous individuals and governmental bodies which equally are concerned, if the reported interview is authentic. And the interview was authentic. But we see in the evening news of the same day that the Haitian minister explains that's not what he said. I never heard of Fort Riviere, Bellegrade said was his response, and I do not think Haitians generally have ever heard of it. He did not deny that there was a Fort Riviere or that it had been stormed and captured by Butler, then a major, and his men, he declared. He said that he was ignorant of the existence of such a fort, and that Major Butler's report of the capture of the stronghold was sent directly to the Navy Department and was not made known to Haitians, who had no knowledge of the fight which Butler described. So a simple misunderstanding of words lost in translation? Or was it? We see 4 days later, on April 29, 1931, the Haitian minister made some more comments about another medal Smedley Butler received while in Haiti. The question of why General Smedley D. Butler was awarded the Haitian Medal Militaire took the spotlight today from the original controversy over Minister Bellegarde's doubts as to the existence of Fort Riviere, for the capture of which Butler received the Congressional Medal of Honor. The Haitian minister's implication yesterday that the Medal Militaire was awarded Butler not for the capture of the fort, but as a reward for Butler's aid in forestalling certain financial plans by American interests, provoked a prompt denial today by Colonel Frederick M. Weiss, U.S. Marine Corps retired, who prepared the medal citation. Colonel Weiss, Argonne hero and close friend of Butler, declared that while Butler may have aided President D'Artabanov in besting a group of New York financial interests who were seeking a monopoly in gold importation for Haiti, the award had no connection with the incident. So that's pretty interesting. Aside from the talk about why medals were awarded, looks like Smedley Butler thwarted the plans of some of the Wall Street bankers during his time in Haiti. The following month, in May of 1931, Smedley Butler would now be in Oregon helping to organize the Oregon State Police, traveling the state by plane, something of a big deal back in those days. On August 20th, 1931, we see Smedley Butler put in for retirement, effective October 1st. In March of 1932, Smedley Butler announced he was running in the Pennsylvania Republican primaries for U.S. Senate. And we see the next month in April 1932. Smedley Butler would lose, with only 37.52% of the vote, compared to James Davis's 60.07% of the vote. And the two main reasons Smedley Butler lost can be seen right in this article. The Davis victory over General Butler is a blow to the Dries and a boost for the Wets. Davis espoused the anti-prohibition cause after William S. F.D.R., the Republican boss of Pennsylvania, threatened to put an organization candidate in the race against him if Davis did not declare against the 18th Amendment. General Butler ran as a bone dry. So there's William F.D.R. again, resuming his battles with Smedley Butler. But Butler ran as a bone dry? As popular as Smedley Butler was at the time, and you can be the most popular person there is, but if you campaign against an even more popular idea, the idea will win every time. And getting rid of prohibition was certainly one of the most popular ideas at that time. A month later, in May of 1932, we see the formation of the Bonus Army in Portland, Oregon. Starting out with 310 World War I veterans, they were on their way to Washington to demand their war bonuses. And the war bonus pay was awarded to them by Congress in 1924, which basically would see the veterans get up to $1.25 per day of their military service during World War I. Except there was one catch. The bonuses wouldn't mature until a 20-year period had expired, meaning the veterans couldn't cash in their bonuses until the 1940s. But in 1932, as the Great Depression raged on, this group of veterans decided to go to Washington and demand immediate payment of their World War I bonus money. And we see just a few days later, bonus armies were sprouting up all over the country and were heading to Washington. And by early July, there were makeshift camps set up everywhere, absolutely dominating the core of Washington, D.C. Now remember the January 6th insurrection? Well, not to diminish some of the actual carnage that took place that day, but I noticed CNN's panic-mongering commentary certainly didn't match what they were showing me on the screen.
They are inside Statuary Hall. This is a legendary place where all of us who've covered Capitol Hill, it's hard to believe what we're seeing right there.
And yes, that is hard to believe what we're seeing there, Wolf. I mean, look at what they're doing.
It's hard to believe what we're seeing right there. They're just walking through.
Yep, that is hard to believe there, Wolf. Clearly, what we're witnessing here is not a peaceful protest. Now let's hear from correspondent Jay Crapper.
It's stunning, Wolf. It's absolutely stunning, and it's quite frankly dangerous.
Well, Jay Crapper's absolutely stunned. Let's hear from Dana Bash.
Unusual as terrifying and as surprising as what we are seeing is going on. Protesters who, of course, have the right to protest. But this is beyond that. As John said, this is basically taking over, storming the Capitol. It's anarchy. It really is anarchy.
And I have to agree, the terrifying anarchy of these protesters walking through, in an orderly fashion no less, and taking pictures even, absolutely leaves me with a feeling of being in an unbelievably dangerous situation, as Wolf and Jake and Dana have described for me. Maybe Pamela Brown has some more top-notch journalistic acumen to add to this?
By storming the United States Capitol?
Look at that. That is outside. Jake, I'm sorry to interrupt, but look at those pictures. Have you ever seen anything like that? I mean, these are protesters outside on the steps of the Capitol.
Well, it would seem that the CNN paparazzi were out of their depth and collectively crapping their pants.
This is a moment I never saw in my life.
No, I've never seen anything like this.
Look at those pictures. Have you ever seen anything like that?
And, well, yes, Pamela, I have actually. And I have to say, for a network that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, that employs a huge staff to report the news, the CNN journalists do not seem to be very well informed.
Look at those pictures. Have you ever seen anything like that?
And now let's have a look at the events of July 2nd, 1932, at the Capitol building.
In their last stand at the United States Capitol, the bonus army broke through police lines and surged up the steps as they staged a final demonstration which they hoped would induce the government to pay the cash they demanded.
This is a moment I never saw in my life.
No, I've never seen anything like this.
Look at those pictures. Have you ever seen anything like that?
And there you go. So none of them, including longtime legendary newsman Wolf Blitzer, had any idea this had happened before? This being a mob of protesters rushing the Capitol building? I also didn't see any of the other major outlets bringing up the 1932 incident while covering January 6th either. Maybe some, even one, did perhaps? If so, I didn't notice. Not even from Fox News. But anyways, no one back then, in 1932, was calling this an insurrection, or sedition, or an attempted coup.
President Trump could stop this with one tweet, but instead he's on Twitter attacking Vice President Pence for refusing to go along with his attempt at a coup.
And in 1932, this was organized and called for by one man, Walter Waters, a World War I veteran who was the leader of the bonus army. Though what would eventually happen wasn't exactly what he had in mind. What he had in mind for the Capitol was a parade, and to picket the House and Senate buildings. Dictator Walter W. Waters ordered 5,000 men of the Bonus Expeditionary Force to mass at the Capitol today in protest against the forthcoming adjournment of Congress. And notice the word dictator is sandwiched between quotes, and that's because all the veterans of the Bonus Army had a vote and voted Walters as their leader and gave him dictatorial powers over the course of their action, though over time his support would start waning. And despite the events at the Capitol building that day, the Bonus Army wasn't leaving anytime soon. And interestingly, on the same day, July 2nd, 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt would become the Democratic nominee for president. The next day, on July 3rd, we see F.D.R. introducing the New Deal into his platform. Two days later, on July 5th, we see veterans mass on steps of Senate and boo Hoover. The Bonus Expeditionary Forces marched up the Capitol Hill and then marched down again today, concluding a brief demonstration on the Senate steps during which President Hoover was booed. And good for him. Remember, as we saw in Part 1, Chapter 9 of this series, Hoover was part of the creation of the military-industrial complex, in charge of the entire food supply during the war. On July 8, 1932, we see Smedley Butler, a lifelong Republican, is going to vote for Roosevelt. Now we fast forward a couple of weeks to July 20th, 1932, and we see the night before Smedley Butler was at one of the Bonus Army's camps speaking to them in support.
As I said before, he's a real soldier, a real man, a real gentleman, and a real comrade. I take pleasure in introducing to you Major General Smedley Butler, retired of the U.S. Marine Corps.
Somebody, yeah, God, you have just as much right to have a lobby here as any steel corporation. Yeah. Look, makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No. And it's an honor, a privilege to come here and be with you. I mean just what I say. I don't want anything. Nobody can kick me anymore. And I'll say what I please. Who in the hell has done all the bleeding for this country and for this law and this Constitution anyhow but you fellas? I know. I had a rotten old mud hole of a camp in France. Well, 2 million of you went through. Yeah, I know. I know who's made this country worth living in. It's just you fellas.
A week after Smedley Butler spoke to the Bonus Army, on July 28, 1932, all hell would break loose in Washington, D.C.
Police are entering the first of a score of old buildings appropriated by bonus seekers to clear them out. In many of the old buildings, which are about to be torn down, the eviction proceeded with little trouble. In some spots, the bonus seekers fortify themselves.
Then President Hoover would bring in the army.
With one dead and scores hurt in a clash with police following government orders that the bonus army's camps must be cleared, troops are arriving to carry out the president's edict. With cavalry advancing upon them, backed up by cold steel, there isn't much the veterans can do except give way. For weeks they've been making a desperate stand for what they considered their rights, but in the face of armed troops, retreat is the only alternative.
So they're being forced out of their shacks by smoke bombs and tear gas hurled by the troops who have been called out by the President of the United States.
The gas has done its work, and it only remains for fire to complete the task set for the soldiers.
And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic bonus army that ends so disastrously in the shadow of the capital of the United States of America.
And that's truly a dark chapter in American history, and one most viewers probably don't even know about. And here's a few more things you might not have known. When the orders came down from President Hoover to clear out the bonus army, here's who led the U.S. Army's assault. The task of aiding the district police was given to War Secretary Hurley. He ordered General Douglas MacArthur, Chief of Staff, to surround and clear out the troubled area, using all possible humanity. And that didn't work out too well. And as the army came marching in, here's MacArthur looking on. And see the guy he's talking to on the right? That's then Major Dwight Eisenhower, MacArthur's then aide in Washington. So both MacArthur and Eisenhower were there, leading U.S. troops against its own citizens for the first time since the Civil War, citizens who were made up of World War I veterans no less, and using tear gas, fire, bayonets, cavalry, and even tanks, while burning down huge portions of Washington, D.C. And again, this is an event that most today know nothing about. And there was another person there you're probably familiar with, but probably never heard this part of their story, and that's then Major George Patton, who led the cavalry. And how do you like this for a story you've probably never heard before? One of the most dramatic sidelights of the Army's drive on the bonus expeditionary force last night centered around Major George Patton of the cavalry, who was compelled by duty to rout from Camp Marks a man who once saved his life on a battlefield in France some 14 years ago. During the World War, Major Patton held the rank of colonel in charge of light tanks. His aide was a youth from Camden, New Jersey named Joe Angelo. So how do you like them apples? And here's a newspaper report on Patton's injury in World War I. And here's what happened. Within 40 meters of the German machine guns, Private Angelo carried his wounded commanding officer into a shell hole and remained with him under continuous shell fire for over an hour, except when he twice carried orders to passing tanks. So how do you like that? He saves Patton's life in World War I, and 14 years later Patton returns the favor by chasing him out of Washington and burning half the city down doing so. They didn't cover that time period in the movie. And as I mentioned earlier, I find it interesting that all four of these generals played a role of sorts in events involving the bonus army, with Smedley Butler in support of one side, the veterans, and Generals MacArthur, Eisenhower, and Patton on the other. And today most people only know of Eisenhower, Patton, and MacArthur because of their World War II actions. And I decided to do a Google search to see how much mention the mainstream news media has given to the 1932 storming of the Capitol building, or the army being called in by President Hoover and gassing and flaming around 20,000 US citizens out of the city. As I mentioned previously, I hadn't noticed any after the January 6th protests. So in looking up both ABC and ABC News, I literally found no stories at all mentioning the events at the Capitol building in 1932, or the army storming in. Same with Fox News. Same with MSNBC, or NBC News, or just NBC. And of course CNN has nothing listed about it.
It's stunning. It's absolutely stunning.
CBS does have a short article, published in 1998. But in talking about the actions of MacArthur, Eisenhower, and Patton, CBS has the wrong date. And no mention of the rushing of the Capitol building, and no mention of Smedley Butler being there on the 19th making a speech. The New York Times has articles in their archives section, of course, as they were a paper at that time as well, but the only modern mention I could find that popped up was from 1990, in their books section. The only article I found when I typed in the Washington Post was an article posted during the Black Lives Matter protests during the summer of 2020, which is odd, as like the New York Times, they were in existence back then as well. And like CBS, the writer here has the wrong date. It's the wrong year. And while the article's main topic wasn't about the 1932 protests, and only had a brief mention displayed here, the writer did include MacArthur, Eisenhower, and Patton, but no mention of Smedley Butler's July 19th speech, or the July 2nd rushing of the Capitol building. So overall, it would appear that I know more about American history than a bunch of multi-million-dollar news media outlets. Can this be true?
It's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. I've never seen anything like this.
Some mainstream outlets such as PBS and Time do have posted articles on these events, so how can others be so blind?
Have you ever seen anything like that?
This is a moment I never saw in my life.
Bloomberg wrote about it, also in the summer of 2020, in the middle of the BLM protests, focusing on the July 28th actions of bringing in the army to quell protests, letting the reader know that, quote, it backfired badly, end quote. Meaning that it backfired badly for President Hoover. As we see here, the public blamed him for the atrocious actions of the military, although it was actually MacArthur who overstepped his mandate. And just to go a little further on that, MacArthur and Patton were all for the actions that took place, with MacArthur calling the shots. But MacArthur's top aide, Major Eisenhower, was actually calling for more tempered actions, but was overruled. And I'm guessing those temperaments would later play a role in why Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied Commander in World War II and not MacArthur or Patton. Anyways, 3 months later, these events, in combination with many other factors, would see Franklin D. Roosevelt overwhelmingly win the presidency. And with his presidency beginning in 1933, and as we now come full circle back to where we were near the beginning of this chapter, we see that right off the bat President Roosevelt would have a lot more than just the Great Depression to deal with. A plot to take over the White House was developing.
And there must be an end to a conduct in banking and in business which too often has given to a sacred trust the likeness of callous and selfish wrongdoing.
I'll bet the current generation of the Wall Street Kings didn't like much of what they were hearing. As for the plot to remove President Roosevelt, the public wouldn't know about it until the next year, November of 1934, when Smedley Butler broke the news that he was approached by Wall Street interests to head a fascist army to support the White House takeover. The New York Post says in a copyrighted story today that Major General Smedley D. Butler has disclosed that he has been asked by a group of, quote, wealthy New York brokers to lead a fascist movement to set up a dictatorship in the United States, end quote. The paper says General Butler, who retired from the Marine Corps 3 years ago, has been subpoenaed by the Congressional Committee on Un-American Activities, and that he has said he is ready to testify. And that's the McCormack-Dickstein Committee that we saw in the last chapter of this series. And also, as we saw earlier in this chapter, it's around this time that the American Nazi organization Friends of New Germany have chapters firmly rooted across the country, which is rapidly growing into the German-American Bund. Of course, I told the leaders of this fascist movement that I wasn't interested in fascism or any otherism, the Post quoted Butler as saying, and that I wouldn't consider any such proposition. The Post says General Butler said he was approached by Gerald P. McGuire of the brokerage firm of Grayson M.P. Murphy and Company and asked to organize 500,000 veterans into a fascist army. McGuire, at his office today, denied that the story was true and said that he could not understand the reason for its publication. The writer of the story, Paul Comley French of the staff of the New York Post, says in the article that after learning of the facts from General Butler, he interviewed McGuire in New York and obtained substantially the same information from him. Now we'll start digging into Smedley Butler's testimony before the Congressional Committee. But before we do, there's a few things to understand about these documents. First off, the ones we looked at in the last chapter, which showed that Prescott Bush, President George H.W. Bush's father, along with Alvaro Harriman and Percy Rockefeller and others, through the Hamburg-American line, were helping Nazi Germany. Those hearings took place earlier in the year in June of 1934. While Smedley Butler gave testimony about the White House plot starting November 21st, 1934. And also, when you go to look for Smedley Butler's testimony, you'll find that the cover page for that volume sits partway through the documents. And the next page where Smedley Butler's testimony starts is on page 8, as the first 7 pages are missing. Those missing pages contain the testimony of Captain Samuel Glazer, and he was telling a similar story to Smedley Butler's. An Army captain, Samuel Glazier of Baltimore, in charge of a civilian conservation camp at Eldridge, Missouri, gave the committee the testimony concerning the dictatorship plan. Glazier said that Jackson Martindale, New York attorney, had discussed with him formation of the, quote, American Vigilantes, end quote, 500,000 strong, and backed with $700 million to turn out the administration and set up Martindale as dictator. Glazier testified in New York recently. His testimony was made public before Steele appeared before the committee. And we'll see yet another person with a similar story coming up. But about the missing documents from the investigation. As we can see here, even today in 1975, a full transcript of the hearings cannot be traced. And we'll see why coming up. But let's get to what's left of the testimony of Smedley Butler that still does survive to this day. And I'm not going to read it all, as that would take forever, but I'll point out and highlight some of his testimony and explain as we go along, and you can pause and read the fuller segments at your leisure. And here, he's explaining to the committee that he was first approached by Gerald McGuire around the 1st of July 1933, and they were looking to get Smedley Butler to simply do some speeches at the American Legions, with a political slant against Roosevelt. And Smedley Butler tells the committee, "I thought I smelled a rat right away," about his first meetings with McGuire. Here, Smedley Butler is explaining to the committee that he played along with McGuire and the group he represented, saying he was fishing to see what they had in mind. During other visits, Smedley Butler says that McGuire showed him bank receipts of large amounts of money to show Butler they had the backing and the support for what they were going to do. In another meeting, McGuire pulled out 18 $1,000 bills and tried to give it to Smedley Butler, to which Butler said he replied, "Don't you try to give me any $1,000 bill." Here, we see one of the bigger fish in the plot being named, Robert Sterling Clark. And while you might not be familiar with who he is, you might be familiar with the company where his family fortune comes from, the Singer Sewing Corporation. Here, Smedley Butler says that Robert Sterling Clark told him that Clark was willing to spend half of his fortune of $30 million backing the plot. Here, Smedley Butler says he last saw Gerald McGuire near the end of November 1933, as McGuire was heading off to Europe. And at that time, Butler wasn't sure if McGuire was being honest, or just playing rich people like Robert Sterling Clark to suck money out of them. And then in August of 1934, Smedley Butler would hear from McGuire again, wanting to meet with Butler. He told Smedley Butler he had went to Italy, Germany, Russia, and France to study the top fascist organizations in each country to model what they wanted to do in the United States. When Smedley Butler asked McGuire what President Roosevelt might think of this, he said McGuire was at first putting it like it would be helping the president and talking of a position like an assistant president. Here we see one of the biggest names in the plot when Smedley Butler says that McGuire told him, "The Morgan interests say that you cannot be trusted." Smedley Butler then explained to the committee that he went to his friend Paul Comley French and explained the basics of what he'd been going through with McGuire, hoping French with his newspaper resources would check it all out and see too if he felt McGuire and his group were for real. Here, Smedley Butler told the committee when he was trying to find out who the leaders of this group were that McGuire was representing, he asked McGuire what they would be called. And McGuire's response was, "You watch, in 2 or 3 weeks you will see it come out in the paper. There will be big fellows in it." And Smedley Butler said to the committee, he did not give me the name of it, meaning the organization, but he said that it would all be made public, the Society to Maintain the Constitution and so forth. They had a lot of talk this time about maintaining the Constitution. And these conversations between Smedley Butler and Gerald McGuire took place in early August 1934. And then on August 23, 1934, the news would break about the formation of the American Liberty League. a group of prominent businessmen all aligned with anti-Roosevelt leanings, reportedly formed to guard the Constitution. And in the leadership committee of this new organization, we see a René DuPont. The immediate membership was a bipartisan group that literally had no Roosevelt supporters in it, and included Democrats who were opposed to Roosevelt's nomination to begin with. And their goal was to amass 3 to 4 million members. And we see here, the president's reaction is awaited. And they wouldn't have to wait long, as we see 2 days later on August 25th, President Roosevelt has accepted the formation of the American Liberty League as an invitation to do battle. Now, something else about the Dixteen-McCormack Committee report that goes along with the plenty of missing pages no longer in existence is that a lot of Smedley Butler's testimony was removed from the record before these documents were even printed, which we'll also look into coming up. But right now, let's hear directly from Smedley Butler.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government. I talked with an investigator for this committee who came to me with a subpoena on Sunday, November 18th. He told me they had unearthed evidence linking my name with several such veteran organizations. As it then seemed to me to be getting serious, I felt it was my duty to tell all I knew of such activities to this committee. My main interest in all this is to preserve our democratic institution. I want to retain the right to vote, the right to speak freely, and the right to write. If we maintain these basic principles, our democracy is safe. No dictatorship can exist with suffrage, freedom of speech, and press.
Now we'll run through a little more of the surviving documents of the McCormack-Dickstein Committee. And the committee interviewed Paul Comley French, who told them he got in touch with McGuire and met with him on September 13, 1934, at McGuire's office at Grayson M.P. Murphy and Company. And Grayson M.P. Murphy is also a longtime J.P. Morgan man. And we also see longtime J.P. Morgan and Company partners Henry Davison and Thomas Lamont, who we've seen a few times in this series already, along with Grayson M.P. Murphy, were all directors at Guarantee Trust as well. And here French tells the committee some of what McGuire had told French, which corresponds exactly with what Smedley Butler had described to him and the committee. The committee of course brought in Gerald McGuire over multiple days, but I'll not waste our time reading over his denials and lies. Pretty much everything he said was a lie. At the same time, the Congressional Committee was interviewing Smedley Butler, Gerald McGuire, Paul Comley French, and others. The FBI on November 22, 1934, sent out a memorandum stating, during a telephonic conversation with Colonel Gates, the Colonel asked if we had anything on the Smedley Butler case. I stated that we did not have anything. The Colonel stated that the newspapers were beginning to press him concerning it, and the Baltimore Sun has the story that the Department of Justice doesn't know whether General Butler is having just another brainstorm or what. And the New York Evening Post telephoned him and informed him that some paper in New York had the story that the Department of Justice was going to investigate Smedley Butler. I told the Colonel that we were not going to investigate General Butler, according to any knowledge I had. Very truly yours, John Edgar Hoover, Director. And we'll hear from J. Edgar Hoover again before this chapter is over. The next day, November 23, 1934, the committee interviewed Claude Adamson, an employee of the Central Hanover Bank. And they went over a bunch of various deposits into accounts belonging to McGuire. And there were also letters of credit in large amounts put into McGuire's accounts. And a letter of credit is basically a deposit of money that McGuire can draw on from anywhere he desires that has an expiry date. So it's money he can use for whatever purposes he needs, wherever he is, but only for a limited time. And here they continue discussing letters of credit, followed by more denial and more lies from Gerald McGuire, which we'll see in the conclusions coming up. On December 29, 1934, the committee brought in Francis Rempe, an accountant for Robert Sterling Clark, who brought some of Clark's documents and records to the committee, and they discussed $15,000 which was withdrawn from Robert Sterling Clark's personal account. And paid to Gerald McGuire. And they also asked him about $50,000 that was withdrawn from Robert Sterling Clark's account, which was paid to the Chase National Bank. Of interest here is that in 1930, the Equitable Trust Company, the Interstate Trust Company, and the original Chase National Bank would merge while keeping the name Chase National Bank. And they would become the biggest bank in the world, with John D. Rockefeller Jr. its biggest client, and pretty much control of it through its longtime president, Winthrop Aldrich, who also happens to be John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s brother-in-law. This of course doesn't mean that John Rockefeller Jr. played a role in the plot, but it is interesting to see links to the Rockefeller name, along with the names DuPont and Morgan. Another of the things that seems to be missing from the original documents is the committee's conclusions. I've never found an original copy. And remember how we saw, even today in 1975, a full transcript of the hearings cannot be traced? Well, let's have a look at the internal security legislation hearings from 1954. Monday, April 5th, 1954. And John McCormack is still in Congress. And he brings up that he was chairman of the McCormack-Dickstein Committee in 1934. And we see Representative Lewis Graham say, "May I interrupt for a question, Mr. McCormack?" To which John McCormack replies, "Certainly." And Lewis Graham states, "That report I read many years ago. It is very rare and is hard to get. And if there is no objection, I think it would be well to introduce it in the record at this time, so it would be available in our report." So how about that? Way back in 1954, even Congress is saying that the McCormack-Dickstein Committee report is rare and hard to get. And no doubt that's because of its content. And John McCormack thanks Lewis Graham, and a record of the conclusions of the McCormack-Dickstein Committee report were entered into the record of this committee's investigation. The McCormack-Dickstein Committee report conclusions only, though. You won't find all the testimony of Smedley Butler, Gerald McGuire, Paul Comley French, and others in these documents. And about the plot to take over the White House, the McCormack-Dickstein Committee's conclusions stated, "In the last few weeks of the committee's official life, it received evidence showing that certain persons have made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. No evidence was presented, and this committee had none to show a connection between this effort and any fascist activity of any European country. There was no question but that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. This committee received evidence from Major General Smedley D. Butler, retired, twice decorated by the Congress of the United States. He testified before the committee as to conversations with one Gerald C. McGuire, in which the latter is alleged to have suggested the formation of a fascist army under the leadership of General Butler. McGuire denied all these allegations under oath, but your committee was able to verify all the pertinent statements made by General Butler, with the exception of the direct statement suggesting the creation of the organization. This, however, was corroborated in the correspondence of McGuire with his principal, Robert Sterling Clark, of New York City, while McGuire was abroad studying the various forms of veterans' organizations of fascist character. So there was indeed a plot to overthrow President Roosevelt and turn the United States into a dictatorship. And while Gerald McGuire denied all of the allegations, the committee was able to verify everything Smedley Butler said. And remember, we saw that Captain Samuel Glazer gave testimony about the dictatorship plot as well, although most of the pages containing his testimony are missing? Here's a letter sent to John McCormick from a friend of his, Peter A. Green, sent on November 22, 1934. And he writes to John McCormick telling him that he just read in the newspaper that McCormick was on the committee investigating the plot to overthrow President Roosevelt, and then he starts telling McCormick that he's been working at the Boulder Dam in Nevada and what he's been up to. And then he gets back to the fascist plot and tells McCormick that he was approached right after the election with an offer to be the leader of a group in Nevada. He brings up some of the people he was told were involved, including Smedley Butler, and said that he told them that it sounded like a communist idea to him, but they said that it was to make the government a party of equal rights to all and put the president out of office and put in a dictator. So even one of John McCormick's friends is telling him the same story that he's hearing from Smedley Butler and Samuel Glazer at the hearings. And although he admits in the committee's final report that there was indeed a plot to take over the White House, Chairman McCormick was also doing damage control by omitting certain sections of testimony from the report and not bringing any of the big names in for questioning during the committee's investigations. A couple months later, beginning in January of 1935, veteran political journalist John Spivak would write a series of articles about the scandal, unveiling a lot of the top people behind it. He was mistakenly given copies of the stenographed notes of the closed-door testimony, which contained a lot more testimony than what was published by the committee. And then he set up interviews with committee chairman John McCormick and committee vice chairman Samuel Dickstein. When he told John McCormick that he had the stenographic notes, McCormick wasn't too happy to hear that. And that pretty much ended the interview. Samuel Dickstein, on the other hand, was much more cooperative, though it seemed like he really didn't know much about what was going on, but some of his answers were pretty interesting to hear. When asked why the committee didn't investigate ties to the American Liberty League, Dickstein responded, "Well, we didn't have the time, or the money, or we would have." When asked why Grayson MP Murphy wasn't called to the committee, again Dickstein responded, "We didn't have the time. We would have taken care of the whole Wall Street group if we had the time. I would have no hesitation in going after the Morgans." And by the Morgans he means J.P. Morgan Jr. and his partners, like Thomas Lamont and Henry Davison. When asked about why Felix Warburg wasn't questioned about his connections to a Nazi working in the Bank of Manhattan, a bank under the Warburg's control, Dickstein's response was, "I don't know." And after informing Samuel Dickstein of all kinds of involved parties and how they are all interconnected financially, Dickstein responded, "I wish you had told me that while the committee was in session," he said plaintively. "I'd have called Murphy and Morgan and Warburg and anyone else involved." Here's an example of some of the testimony that was removed before the committee published its report. And in these articles, it's the text in italics that they removed from the original testimony, and I've highlighted it in yellow so you can see it better. And we looked at this portion from the committee's published version earlier when we saw Smedley Butler telling the committee he was asking Gerald McGuire what their organization was called, or would be called, and McGuire said it would come out in the newspapers in 2 or 3 weeks. And I've highlighted and separated by color that portion we saw earlier so you can easily see where the missing testimony slots into. And they removed where Smedley Butler started talking about the American Liberty League, and actually all mentions of the American Liberty League were stricken from the report, as well as mention by Smedley Butler of Al Smith, a one-time presidential candidate who lost the election to President Herbert Hoover in 1928, and then lost in the Democratic primaries of the 1932 election to the eventual president, Roosevelt. And now he's playing his part in this scandal, which was using his influence with the American Legion to stir up the veterans. Here's a wall of Paul Comley French's testimony that was removed. And we see in his testimony he told the committee that Gerald McGuire told him that they could arm their army of veterans through the Remington Arms Company on credit from the DuPonts. And he too brings up the American Liberty League, and though French said McGuire brought up Remington Arms and the DuPonts, he wasn't sure if McGuire outright mentioned the name American Liberty League. And just so you're not confused, as we saw in Part 1, Chapter 5 of this series, the Rockefellers and Marcellus Hartley Dodge owned Remington Arms during World War I. But in May of 1933, the DuPonts bought them out, giving the DuPonts control of Remington Arms. And take notice of when Smedley Butler says he was first approached by Gerald McGuire, around July 1st, 1933, mere weeks after the DuPonts took over Remington Arms, so that's pretty interesting. Anyways, John Spivak goes into some of the connections to J.P. Morgan Jr., explaining a little bit about Grayson M.P. Murphy, and we see more Morgan partners associated with him in A.M. Anderson and H.P. Davison Jr., the son of Henry Pomeroy Davison, who we saw a little bit of in Part 1 of the series. And we see that Murphy is also a director of the Guarantee Trust Company, along with Thomas W. Lamont and George Whitney. Here, John Spivak names some of the bigger contributors, partners, and backers of the American Liberty League, which includes John W. Davis, another Democrat presidential candidate that lost the election, which makes 2 Democrats that lost previous elections now plotting against President Roosevelt. And Davis is the director of Guarantee Trust as well. We see a few other names, including Robert Sterling Clark, who was funding Gerald McGuire. Then there's the DuPonts, including one we haven't seen yet in this series, Archibald DuPont, and that's the only picture I could find of him. And of course there are others, and Spivak writes about some of them as well and how they're connected to the plot, such as the Warburgs and even William Randolph Hearst. So overall, the people behind the plot are a who's who of Wall Street and industry giants. I don't believe there was one single person or entity as leader, so to speak. While J.P. Morgan Jr. and the DuPonts were probably the biggest and most influential names, I believe the plot was being run by a wide-ranging group on consensus and agreements of who can provide what, when needed. And something to keep in mind is that while their now exposed plot of installing a fascist dictatorship in the United States included the formation of an army as muscle and intimidation, they were looking to form that army from the veterans of World War I. They weren't looking to emulate Nazism, just the fascist part of it, which is why Gerald McGuire was sent over to Europe to study it. And because the World War I veterans in the United States loved Smedley Butler so much, this is why the plotters approached him about being the leader of their would-be army. And remember we saw that McGuire told Smedley Butler that the Morgan people didn't want Smedley Butler because they didn't trust him? Their alternative was allegedly Douglas MacArthur, though he would later say he knew nothing about it. But after what MacArthur did to the Bonus Army veterans in the summer of 1932, it would make a lot more sense to try and recruit Smedley Butler, of course. But why would they think Smedley Butler might go along with it? And to answer that question, we'll have to go into some speculation, but of course with some evidence that makes sense of it all. And what I think happened with this plot is that it didn't actually begin in the summer of 1933, after Roosevelt's election, as appears on the surface of things. It began long before that, and it wasn't actually a plot to seize the White House per se, but rather it was a plan to organize and put down a possible communist or workers' uprising, like what had happened in Russia just over a dozen years earlier. And remember, this is right in the middle of the Great Depression as well. But I believe it's very possible, and probably very likely, that this plan, to gather up an army to fight against the possible uprising mob of socialists and communists, was instead transformed into the plot targeting Roosevelt after his inauguration in March of 1933. So, why do I say all of this? Because in the news, on October 2nd, 1931, we see this: Butler sees U.S. revolt. The threat of revolution hangs over this country unless something is done right away to provide employment, relieve poverty, and to equalize wealth, Major General Smedley D. Butler said today in his first interview since his retirement from the U.S. Marines. Butler, who is believed ready to enter politics with his eyes on a U.S. senatorship, revealed details of a plan, quote, on which I have been pondering for more than a year, and which I heard outlined by a group of multimillionaires in a secret conference recently, end quote. 14 of these men represented wealth of $5 billion, Butler said. And we see a little bit more the next day on October 3rd, 1931. Fascism planned in the United States by rich. Major General Butler of the Marines says 14 multimillionaires will back action against rising workers' class revolution. Backed by 14 multimillionaires whose fortunes total $5 billion, Major General Smedley D. Butler of the Marines declared in a speech here Thursday night that he is preparing now for a fascist dictatorship against the workers. The scheme proposed by Butler is described by the United Press as, quote, virtual dictatorship by an extra-governmental agency, end quote. That the bulk of the nation's wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, General Butler stated, is one of the things that ordinary people are concerned about. Another is that there are so many millionaires in the cabinet. As a result, Butler foresees the capitalists in the United States, along with the rest of the world, overrun by revolutionary hordes. To forestall this, Butler has been picked by the multimillionaires he refuses to name, but who are undoubtedly among the leading 59 who now rule the United States, to prepare the fascist dictatorship. So, I didn't see any of this in the McCormack-Dickstein report, or the fuller stenographic notes that John Spivak managed to get a hold of. Perhaps Smedley Butler did testify about all this, and that testimony was removed as well? I suppose we'll never know. And notice when the plan actually started. In October of 1931, Smedley Butler said he had been pondering the plan for more than a year by that point already. So the origins of the original plot, it would appear, started to begin sometime around 1930, which would be in the first year of the Great Depression. And by October of 1931, with things getting worse, and thanks to Smedley Butler doing what he does best, and that's telling it like it is to the newspapers, we can see that the rich and wealthy are developing a plan based on fascism to counter any possible communist movements that may seek to lead an uprising of the masses of poor and unemployed that seem to be ever increasing. And Smedley Butler says he's been pondering it, and considering what the plan is at this point, or looks to be, raising an army as a counter to any possible communist uprising, it would make sense that Smedley Butler would be supportive of something like this, but not any fascist elements, of course. And considering that Smedley Butler had been pondering what the plot or plan was at that point in 1931, explains why some of the plotters in 1933 and 34 thought that they could trust Smedley Butler to be part of the plan again, except that the plan had changed considerably by then. But anyways, as we saw, in July of 1932, Franklin Roosevelt wins the Democrat nomination and pledges his New Deal if he's elected president. Then on November 8th, Roosevelt easily wins the election and becomes president-elect. And on March 4th, 1933, President Roosevelt's first inauguration takes place, and he immediately starts putting his New Deal policies in place, which the Wall Street crowd are absolutely against. 2 months later, in May of 1933, the DuPonts take over Remington Arms. 2 months after that, in July of 1933, is when Smedley Butler was first approached by Gerald McGuire. And something to keep in mind is that the first bunch of times McGuire was meeting with Smedley Butler, he was trying to get Smedley Butler to do a bunch of speeches at the Legion Halls to the veterans and stuff like that. He wasn't talking about fascism and raising an army and those things yet. And Smedley Butler didn't know who Gerald McGuire was either. So at that point, in the summer of 1933, there's no reason for Smedley Butler to put two and two together and think Gerald McGuire is trying to recruit him into some version of the 1930-31 plan that he did know about, and probably thought was in the past by now. And then McGuire goes off and tours Europe studying the fascist organizations in the various countries, and was especially impressed with what he saw in France, which is another long story on its own. Then McGuire comes back and starts meeting with Smedley Butler again, and this is when he starts telling Smedley Butler about the plot to take over the White House and the formation of an army, and so on. And on November 20th, 1934, Smedley Butler would begin to testify at the already ongoing congressional investigation of Nazi propaganda and investigation of certain other propaganda activities. And on the same day, Paul Comley French would start releasing his articles in the New York Post. And because the story exploded across the newspapers, the McCormack-Dickstein Committee would release a public statement about Smedley Butler's testimony on November 24th, and then would release their now fragmented report on December 29th, 1934, after removing a bunch of testimony, of course. Then a month later, on January 29th, 1935, some of that removed testimony would be revealed to the public. And the next month in February saw more revelations of who was involved in the plot, which of course included a bunch of high-profile names. So that's quite an interesting timeline of events. And of course it gets even more interesting. The plans of the plot were brought to a halt in November, when Smedley Butler made the plot publicly known, which in turn forced the Congressional Committee to release a public statement about it, followed by the committee's report in December, followed by more revelations in January and February. And here's what's really interesting. In March of 1935, Gerald McGuire would die. And as is just about always the case when there's a major scandal involving the high-profile rich and/or powerful, and there's a death or deaths involved, we see here too there's some controversy about it. This article says Gerald McGuire died of uremia. And here we see the fascist probe being blamed by McGuire's brother. The announcement of his death was made by his brother, William J. McGuire, who at the same time issued a statement saying, Dr. Renahan of Stanford specifically stated that this last illness can be directly attributed to the unjust charges launched by Congressman McCormack's committee, which was apparently based on General Butler's charge, which he afterwards denied making. Dr. Lawrence Renahan declined to comment on the statement of William J. McGuire. Except here we see that McGuire's statement was branded as false and without authority by Dr. Lawrence A. Renahan. The physician said, I made no such comment because I know nothing of Mr. McGuire's affairs. While McGuire gave uremia as the cause of his brother's death, Dr. Frank Toole, attending physician, attributed the death of the 38-year-old bond salesman to pneumonia and complications. So overall, on the face value of it, it looks like McGuire's brother was making stuff up. But taking a second look, the sheer timing of his death gives me pause for thought. I mean, if there was a need to have anyone silenced, just simply to ensure that no more details of the plot would surface to the public's attention, McGuire would be a prime candidate, as he's just a pawn doing the bidding of the bigger names. And him being the central figure, from European scouting trips and trying to lure in Smedley Butler, he knew quite a lot. So it's quite the coincidence that he would suddenly die when he did. And did he die of uremia or pneumonia and complications? What complications, I wonder? And it was McGuire's brother, William J. McGuire, that said he died of uremia. And the thing I'm wondering about is that if he was just making something up, which could easily be argued here, I just wonder how he came to that particular conclusion. I mean, uremia? I never heard of it and had to look it up. And it's a buildup of toxins in the blood. And I'm not sure what McGuire's brother did for a living or how knowledgeable he was overall or anything like that, but I wonder if he heard uremia was the cause from one of the doctors, and that's why he stated that particular condition. If he was blaming the Congressional Committee itself as causing the condition, as what appears the newspapers are attributing to him, and he was only lying and making it up, I would figure he would cite as the cause something like stress from the hearings caused a heart attack, or a stroke, or hypertension or something like that. But he said it was uremia, a buildup of toxins in the blood system. And I don't know, perhaps it's just me, but I find that just a little bit odd. But overall, I'm not saying that Gerald McGuire was murdered. I can accept the pneumonia and complications as being the cause, although I wish I knew what those complications were. But simply because of the sheer coincidence of the timing of his death and the overall role he played in the plot, and there was even a little bit of controversy surrounding his death, I'll not completely rule out the possibility that he was murdered. Whatever the case, being the one most in the spotlight of the investigations, Gerald McGuire's death would put an end to any more investigations that might have followed. A week after McGuire's death, on April 3, 1935, we see in an article on fascism and the suppression of certain news, the identity of the interest for which fascism is now being promoted was revealed in the testimony of General Smedley D. Butler, upon which subject the reactionary press is now silent as the tomb, after simultaneously rushing to the laughing post to laugh it off. On this point, the chairman of the House Committee on Un-American Activities made the following remarks on the floor of the House. At some future date, I should like to discuss more fully the evidence taken by the committee centering around the names of General Smedley D. Butler, Gerald C. McGuire, and Robert Sterling Clark, but it would be useless, at this time, to connect a number of links which General Butler complains we have not done. General Butler gave his evidence before the committee in executive session and told a most fantastic tale, but the peculiar fact is that the story was substantiated by many documents submitted by General Butler, and also substantiated by the money trail of numerous people they investigated, and by other witnesses, including some in the military, and also, as we saw, by one of John McCormack's own friends who was approached about the plot. So John McCormack knew the plot was real, and after everything you've seen in this video about Smedley Butler so far, does he really strike you as a liar? And speaking of liars, the following month on May 16, 1935, J. Edgar Hoover, the infamous longtime FBI director, sent a letter to Attorney General William Stanley. For your information, there is transmitted herewith a copy of a letter addressed to the President of the United States by Mr. E.C. Rodwell, dated at Santa Barbara, California, March 18, 1935, relative to the findings of the Dixteen Congressional Investigating Committee. This letter was referred to me for appropriate attention, No investigation is being made as to the allegations contained in the letter. And here's a copy of the letter, and in it he goes on to list a bunch of the committee's conclusions that he also says in the letter that he's sure President Roosevelt already knows about. And he adds this at the end. My only object in writing this letter is to mildly suggest that the President take the people into his confidence and openly state what his relations are with regard to those fascist groups supported by powerful financiers who have brought misery immeasurable upon the people and who are now seeking to destroy what few liberties they sometimes enjoy. Now, I don't know if this letter ever made it to the President, but do you think Roosevelt knew about the plot against him? Let's have a listen.
The privileged princes of these new economic dynasties, thirsting for power, reached out for control over government itself.
So Roosevelt, of course, knew. And if you've been following this series from the beginning, we saw a lot of the first generation of what I call the Wall Street Kings in the various chapters of Part 1. And of course, the privileged princes are the next generation of the Wall Street Kings. And for some context, here's who was still alive by 1935. And we can't be exactly sure who was more involved in the plot versus others. And that's because it was all covered up and swept aside as much as possible. And while some pictured here may not have been involved at all, some most certainly are. And involved or not, it's pretty much a guarantee that all of them would have been supportive of such a plot had it have gone through. And the reason for the cover-up, and how they got away with it? I can't substantiate and prove anything, of course, but from various books and other research sources, the consensus seems to be that Roosevelt made a deal with the rich to drop the investigations if they agreed to help him push through his New Deal agenda. They could still be vocal against it in public and so on, but behind the scenes it would be agreed that they would use their influence in Congress and the Senate to help push things through that Roosevelt wanted. It was a win for Roosevelt, as the alternative would have been to put the wealthiest people in America in jail during the Great Depression, and I'm sure everyone can agree, then and now, that that would have had disastrous consequences for an already broken economy. At any rate, I'm glad Smedley Butler blew the whistle and sounded the alarm when he did. If he hadn't have went public and testified to the Congressional Committee, and instead went along with the plot, and they did take over the White House, installing a fascist dictatorship in the United States, A, they would most certainly and automatically have the support of all these American Nazis. And B, how long do you think it would take before these guys started to become the muscle for the aging veterans that would have begun the coup? And remember, they have up-and-coming little fascists being trained all over the country during this time period. Hence the real very possibility that by World War II, this might have been a common sight throughout the United States. But with Japan bombing Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, followed by Germany and Italy's declaration of war on the United States in the morning of December 11th, and the United States' war declarations fired right back, patriotism would take over the country, and support for these guys would pretty much be toast. But not all support would disappear, as we'll see in the next chapter of this series. Now remember we saw earlier that Smedley Butler said he was going to start doing speeches once he retired in October of 1931? Over the following years, he would do hundreds of speeches in all kinds of venues. And here's an interesting one he gave in May of 1933, where he warned of war with Japan. Speaking before the Del Mar VA Volunteer Firemen's Association here yesterday, Major General Smedley D. Butler predicted the United States would engage in a war with Japan or Russia in the near future. He said Japan's action in Manchuria was caused by a need for oil, and the present fighting was to give her access to coal, and to put her in a position to fight Russia. And Japan's present fighting was in China. And about Japan's imperialism in China and the region, in that same speech, he said this: I took part in the same kind of shebang in Colombia in 1903, he said. We wanted to build the Canal in Colombia, and the legislators wanted $3,000 apiece. This was too much money, so we started a revolution and recognized the new government before the puppet state had a name. And remember, we saw all of that earlier. Now we'll fast forward a year to April of 1934, so this is before he would testify in Congress about the White House plot. Wars are rackets espoused by munitions trusts in Wall Street, Major General Smedley Butler, retired Marine Corps chief, told veterans of foreign wars here last night. The same crowd that gets up a war and collects the profits from it, he declared, is the one that calls the veterans treasury raiders when they endeavor to get the compensation that is denied them. He urged veterans to drive out of office every public official who espouses a war, and declared a law to conscript capital 60 days before conscripting soldiers for any war would end wars. The United States, he said, entered the World War on the side of the Allies because they owed us more than Germany, and we stood to lose if we didn't. And he means stood to lose the money owed if the United States didn't enter the war, which is something we had a good look at in an earlier chapter of this series. Butler termed the Marines, with which he served more than 33 years, quote, the greatest bill collecting agency ever known, end quote. And here's probably a good example of why the Morgan interest didn't trust Smedley Butler. Wall Street, he declared, will force a Central American country to get a loan, and then, when it cannot or will not pay the interest, will have the Marines down to oust the administration and collect the bill. I know, I took part in the collection end of that racket. And down below we see him giving another warning. A new war is in the making, he said, and unless we look out, we will be in it, on the side that owes us the most. So considering J.P. Morgan Jr. was one of the targets Smedley Butler was talking about, it's no wonder the J.P. Morgan interests didn't trust him. But I would hazard a guess that some of the other plotters saw how much the veterans loved Smedley Butler, and were hoping they could convert him to the updated plot that started from the 1931 plan that they knew Smedley Butler supported at that time, or at least was pondering it, as we saw. Anyways, the year 1935 would bring us two pieces of written works by Smedley Butler that are, to sum up in a single appropriate word, astounding. And the first we'll look at, that we've seen bits and pieces from already in this chapter, is from an article he wrote in the November issue of Commencement magazine. And if you look around at modern day sources, you'll notice the dates given are inconsistent and incorrect, and sometimes they'll attribute Smedley Butler's words to a speech as opposed to something that he wrote. But the full quote actually comes from Commencement magazine's November issue. And the likely reason for the confusion is because Smedley Butler wrote the article stitched together from different pieces of speeches he had given during the previous few years, so some of the lines maybe have come from speeches in 1932, while others may have come from 1933 or 1934. And now let's have a look at what Smedley Butler wrote in 1935. And keep in mind everything you've seen in this video so far. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active service as a member of our country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. I served in all commissioned ranks from a second lieutenant to a major general, and during that period I spent most of my time being a high-class muscleman for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. Thus I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for American fruit companies in 1903. In China, in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. During those years, I had, as the boys in the back room would say, a swell racket. I was rewarded with honors, medals, promotion. Looking back on it, I feel I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was to operate his racket in 3 city districts. We Marines operated on 3 continents. So, we've just seen everything you wrote, and so much more. Now let's fast forward 25 years to 1961 and have a look at some letters from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover again. And here he's writing back to a redacted citizen stating, "Your letter dated March 22, 1961, with its enclosure has been received." And the enclosure was a clipping from an article that had reprinted Smedley Butler's 1935 article that he wrote, that we just looked at. prompting this person to write to J. Edgar Hoover. And we'll come back to Hoover's response to him in a minute, but here's the original letter dated March 22, 1961. And in it, the sender's name, who is redacted, explains how he came across Smedley Butler's 1935 writing in a socialist publication. And he states, "To me it seems incredulous that a man of Smedley D. Butler's caliber would ever utter such a statement." And he explains that he had met Smedley Butler in the First World War a couple times. And then he asks Hoover, "If it is not imposing upon your time and tolerance, I'd appreciate it if you would check in on this item and advise me if it truthfully quotes any statements by General Butler." And here's a copy of the clipping he sent to Hoover, which is a word-for-word match to what Smedley Butler wrote in 1935. Now let's go back and have a look at the letter that Hoover wrote back to him. And incredibly, Hoover would write, "While I would like to be of assistance, the FBI is strictly an investigative agency of the federal government and does not have the funds or the facilities to conduct the research necessary to answer your inquiry. It is suggested that your local library may be in a position to help you in this matter. Pursuant to your request, I am returning the newspaper clipping you submitted with your letter." So Hoover's saying that the FBI doesn't have the funds or the facilities to do the necessary research to answer this guy's question? That question being, did Smedley Butler make those statements? And Hoover can't answer them, or won't. And in this FBI copy, that was all that was sent back to the original letter sender. And the part you see below, and the next page, is information added to the Bureau files for the records. And check out what they write on the next page. To determine whether General Butler made the statements alleged in the newspaper clipping would require considerable time and research. This time and effort does not appear to be warranted, since the statements, if made at all, would necessarily have been made over 20 years ago, inasmuch as Butler died in 1940. So J. Edgar Hoover's FBI not only can't find out if Smedley Butler made those statements, but he's saying it happened over 20 years earlier, so it doesn't matter. And to put that into a modern context, that's kind of like saying statements made about 9/11 don't matter now because it happened over 20 years ago. Anyways, the other 1935 writing by Smedley Butler that we'll have a quick look at was a book he wrote titled War is a Racket. And like what he did when he wrote the article in Common Sense magazine, putting it together from various speeches he had previously made, War is a Racket was done very much the same way. And it isn't a very long book, coming in at about 51 pages, and is easily found on the internet, and it's highly worth the read. And while going into all kinds of numbers and figures in the years leading up to and into World War I, Smedley Butler also takes aim at the Wall Street Kings. Take our friends, the DuPonts, the powder people. Didn't one of them testify before a Senate committee recently that their powder won the war? Or saved the world for democracy? Or something? How did they do in the war? They were a patriotic corporation. Well, the average earnings for the DuPonts for the period 1910 to 1914 were $6 million a year. It wasn't much, but the DuPonts managed to get along on it. Now let's look at their average yearly profit during the war years, 1914 to 1918. $58 million a year profit, we find. Nearly 10 times that of normal times, and the profits of normal times were pretty good. An increase in profits of more than 950%. Take one of our little steel companies that so patriotically shunted aside the making of rails and girders and bridges to manufacture war materials. Well, their 1910 to 1914 yearly earnings averaged $6 million. Then came the war, and like loyal citizens, Bethlehem Steel promptly turned to munitions making. Did their profits jump, or did they let Uncle Sam in for a bargain? Well, the 1914 to 1918 average was $49 million a year. Or let's take United States Steel. The normal earnings during the 5-year period prior to the war were $105 million a year. Not bad. Then along came the war, and up went the profits. The average yearly profit for the period 1914 to 1918 was $240 million a year. Not bad. There you have some of the steel and powder earnings. Let's look at something else. A little copper perhaps. That always does well in war times. Anaconda, for instance, average yearly earnings during the pre-war years 1910 to 1914 of $10 million. During the war years 1914 to 1918, profits leaped to $34 million per year. Now, if you've been following this series so far right from the beginning, you'll see that everything Smedley Butler said is something that we've looked at from the congressional investigations that we were looking at in part 1 of this series. And yet again, Smedley Butler is right on the money. That would be the last of his written works, and he would continue on making speeches around the country in the following years. But sadly, he would pass away on June 21st, 1940, and the world would lose a true hero and patriot. But what an incredible story he leaves behind. Born into a prominent political family, right from the age of 16 years old when he joined the Marines, he lived his life in the public spotlight, who were able to witness his exploits and endeavors grow to unparalleled proportions. He was the most popular figure among the military, and the most popular military figure among the public. He rose up through the ranks like wildfire, and he was there at the roots of U.S. control of Guantanamo Bay, U.S. control of the Panama Canal, and was even there at the roots of what decades later would become Iran-Contra. He took charge of a city's police department, he helped create a state's police department, and he was even the head of a country's entire police force. He met and mingled with multiple U.S. presidents and heads of states from all around the world. As we saw in this video, newspapers followed his exploits right from the age of 16 years old, so he was like a pre-television version of The Truman Show. And speaking of Hollywood, they made movies about Patton and MacArthur, but won't say a peep about Smedley Butler, who in my opinion, you could make a way better movie with. Hell, with his lifelong exploits, you could make a trilogy of trilogies about Smedley Butler. But I suppose the powers that be would rather the general public didn't know about him, because they might discover some uncomfortable truths we've seen in this video. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed this journey into the life of Smedley Darlington Butler, and we'll be seeing some more of him in some upcoming chapters.